I didn't come here to fall in love. I came here to survive. Evelyn Hart's whisper broke against Thomas Grayson's chest as gunfire echoed behind them, her hands fisted in his shirt like he was the only solid ground left in the world. He'd written to the agency for a simple bride, someone plain enough not to break his guarded heart twice. Instead, a beautiful stranger stepped off that stagecoach and stole it, whole secrets, danger and all. Now, a wealthy man from her past rode toward Cedar Hollow to drag her home. And Thomas had one choice left: let her go, or love her enough to burn his whole world down keeping her. Before we continue, if stories like this speak to your heart, press subscribe and join our storytelling family. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel, from the smallest towns to the biggest cities in the world. Thomas Grayson had buried his heart 3 years before Evelyn Hart ever stepped off a stagecoach in Cedar Hollow. He buried it beside his wife Sarah, under the old cottonwood tree at the edge of his property, and he had never once gone looking for it since. People in town used to say Thomas Grayson was the kind of man who could talk a spooked horse into standing still just by lowering his voice. They said he had a gift with animals, with land, with anything that didn't ask him questions about his feelings. They were right about that. What they didn't know was that the same steadiness that made him good with a nervous colt was the same wall he'd built around every soft part of himself. He didn't cry anymore. Not since the funeral. He didn't talk about Sarah anymore, not even to his oldest friend, Walt Bishop, who'd known him since they were boys, chasing jackrabbits through the same fields Thomas now owned. "You can't live your whole life talking to horses, Thomas," Walt told him one evening, leaning against the corral fence while Thomas checked a mare's hoof. "Horses don't lie to me," Thomas said. "Neither do most women if you give them half a chance." Thomas straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I gave a woman my whole chance once, Walt. I'm not looking to do it twice." "So what are you looking to do? Grow old out here talking to cattle?" Thomas didn't answer that. He didn't have to. His silence was answer enough, and Walt knew better than to push. But Walt kept pushing anyway, because that was the kind of friend he was. It was Walt who first mentioned the matchmaking agency out of Helena, a service that paired lonesome ranchers and businessmen with women back east looking for a fresh start. Walt had used it himself 2 years earlier, and his wife Nancy was proof that sometimes a letter and a photograph could turn into something real. "I'm not writing to some agency," Thomas said the first time Walt brought it up. "Why not?" "Because I don't need a wife, Walt. I need this ranch to run smooth, and it runs smooth just fine without one." "Does it?" Walt raised an eyebrow. "When's the last time you had a hot meal that wasn't beans and salt pork? When's the last time this house smelled like anything but horse leather and dust?" Thomas didn't like the answer to that question, so he didn't give one. It took another 6 months, a bad winter, a fever that nearly took him alone in that empty house, with no one to fetch the doctor before. Thomas finally sat down at his kitchen table with a pen in his hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He stared at that paper for a long time before he wrote a single word. What did he even want? He thought about Sarah, about the years they'd had, about how much it had hurt to lose her. He thought about how love had made him weak in ways he never wanted to feel again. How every good morning with her had turned into a debt he paid for the rest of his life the moment she was gone. He decided right there at that table that he wasn't going to make that mistake again. He wasn't looking for love. He was looking for a partner. Someone practical. Someone who understood that a ranch needed running, that meals needed cooking, that a house needed a woman's hand in it without all the risk that came with actually opening his heart. So he wrote it plain, seeking a practical wife for ranch life in Montana Territory. Must be capable of hard work, modest living, and quiet company. No interest in a woman looking for romance or excitement. Simplicity preferred above all else. He read it over. Twice decided it was honest, and sealed it before he could talk himself out of sending it. 3 weeks later, a response arrived. Her name was Evelyn Hart. Her letter was short, shorter than he expected. She wrote plainly, without flourish, that she was seeking a new life away from the East, that she was capable, hard-working, and did not require comfort or luxury to be content. She did not mention family. She did not mention why she wanted to leave. Thomas noticed that, but he didn't ask. He wasn't looking for a woman's whole life story. He was looking for a woman who could cook a meal and keep his house standing upright, and Evelyn Hart's letter told him she could do exactly that, so he wrote back and told her when to arrive. He did not expect to feel nervous the morning her stage was due. He told himself the nervous feeling in his stomach was nothing, just a man making sure things were in order before a stranger came to live under his roof. He put on his good shirt anyway. He told himself that was nothing, too. Walt rode out with him to town that morning, mostly because Walt wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world. "You look like a man walking to his own hanging," Walt said, as they waited outside the stage depot. "I look like a man who hasn't slept. Same thing some days." Walt grinned, clearly enjoying himself far more than Thomas was. "You don't have to be here, Walt. Wouldn't miss it for all the cattle in the territory." Thomas exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. Around them, Cedar Hollow moved through its ordinary morning, the blacksmith's hammer ringing steady, 2 boys chasing a dog past the general store, Mrs. Higgins sweeping her porch and watching the street with the particular attention of a woman who made it her business to know everyone else's business. Thomas caught her eye once and immediately regretted it. Mrs. Higgins straightened, set down her broom, and began walking in their direction, with the unmistakable gait of a woman about to ask questions nobody wanted to answer. "Thomas Grayson," she called out, "is it true you sent away for a mail-order bride?" "Morning, Mrs. Higgins." "Don't you morning me. The whole town's talking. A rancher like you sending off to an agency like some lonesome old bachelor who can't find a wife the honest way." "I am a lonesome old bachelor, Mrs. Higgins." That at least made Walt laugh out loud, which only made Mrs. Higgins purse her lips tighter. "Well," she said, "I hope she's a sensible woman. Ranch life isn't kind to delicate types. I give it 2 months before she's back on that stage crying for home." "We'll see," Thomas said, and he meant it as a way to end the conversation, not as an invitation for more. Mrs. Higgins didn't take the hint. "What's her name?" "Evelyn." "Evelyn what?" "Hart. Never heard the name. East Coast family, I'd guess by the sound of it." Mrs. Higgins tilted her head, studying him, like she could read the whole story off his face if she looked hard enough. "You be careful, Thomas. Women like that coming all this way alone, sometimes they're running from something." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest, at that though he couldn't have said why. "Everybody's running from something, Mrs. Higgins," he said. "That's usually why they end up out here." The stage rolled in 20 minutes later in a cloud of dust and the tired complaint of horses that had gone too many miles without rest. Thomas felt his stomach drop the second the door opened. He didn't know what he expected. Someone plain, he supposed. Someone tired-looking and travel-worn. Someone who would step down uncertainly and search the crowd with anxious eyes until she found the man who'd sent for her. That was not what stepped off that stage. The woman who emerged wore a simple gray traveling dress, plain enough by design, but she carried herself in a way that made the dress seem almost beside the point. She held only one small suitcase. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly, a few strands loose from the journey, and when her eyes swept over the street, over the buildings, over the mountains, rising blue and distant behind the town, there was nothing nervous in the way she looked at Cedar Hollow. She looked at it like she was deciding whether it was good enough for her, not the other way around. Walt let out a low whistle under his breath. "Thomas," he murmured, "I don't think that's the simple woman you asked for." Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth had gone strangely dry. The woman's eyes found him standing there in his good shirt, and something in her expression sharpened, not nervous, not shy, just assessing the way a person might look at a horse they were considering buying. She walked toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Grayson." Her voice was calm, steady, nothing like he expected. "That's right," he managed. "You'd be Miss Hart." "I would." An awkward beat passed between them. Thomas realized he had absolutely no idea what to say to a woman who looked like she'd already decided she wasn't afraid of him. "I expected," He started, then stopped himself. You expected someone else? Evelyn finished for him, not unkindly. I get that reaction a great deal. I expected someone a little more. He searched for the word. Delicate, she offered. I suppose. I'm not delicate, Mr. Grayson. I hope that isn't a disappointment. She glanced past him toward the wagon hitched nearby. Is that our transportation? It is. How far is the ranch from town? Thomas blinked. He'd expected questions about the house, about what she'd be cooking in, what she'd be sleeping on, whether there was a church nearby, whether the neighbors were friendly. He had not expected a question about distance and terrain, asked with the flat practicality of someone planning a campaign. About 6 miles, he said. Good grazing land between here and there. Some. Better on my property. Evelyn nodded slowly as if filing the information away somewhere useful. I'd like to see the boundaries before we reach the house if that's not too much trouble. Walt made a small sound that might have been a laugh he was trying very hard to swallow. You want to see the fence lines? Thomas said, before you've even seen where you'll be sleeping. I need to understand the land before I understand the house, Mr. Grayson. A house is just a house. The land is what keeps us fed. Thomas stared at her a moment too long. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something in his chest that wasn't grief, and wasn't loneliness, and wasn't the careful, guarded nothing he'd trained himself to feel. It was curiosity. And curiosity for a man like Thomas Grayson was more dangerous than he knew. The ride out to the ranch was quieter than Thomas expected, though not uncomfortable. Evelyn watched the land pass with sharp, careful attention, occasionally asking a question about the soil, about water sources, about how many head of cattle he ran, that told Thomas she wasn't making conversation. She was actually listening to the answers. You've done this before, he said finally. Managed land, I mean. Something like it. Where? Does it matter? He glanced sideways at her. I suppose it doesn't. Just curious. I find curiosity is usually the first step toward questions I'd rather not answer, Mr. Grayson. He let that sit for a moment. Fair enough. She seemed to relax slightly after that, as if she'd expected him to push, and was relieved when he didn't. You can call me Thomas, he said. Mr. Grayson makes me sound like my father. Was your father a difficult man? No, just an old one, and I'm not that yet. The faintest smile crossed her face, the first he'd seen. It transformed her just for a moment from the composed stranger who'd stepped off the stage into someone almost warm. Thomas, then, she said. And you may call me Evelyn. Evelyn, he repeated, testing the shape of it. It fit easier in his mouth than he expected it to. They reached the ranch as the afternoon sun slanted gold across the fields. Evelyn's eyes moved over everything: the house, the barn, the corrals, the distant tree line, with the same assessing look she'd given the town. It's a good property, she said finally. Glad it meets your approval. I didn't say that. I said it's good. Whether it's well managed is a separate question. Thomas felt a flicker of something that might have been offense if it weren't so clearly true. You've been here 5 minutes. 5 minutes is enough to see that fence needs mending before winter, and that barn roof has a sag that'll be a real problem come the first heavy snow. Thomas stared at the barn. She wasn't wrong. He'd been meaning to get to that roof for 2 months. You've got an opinion about everything, don't you? He said. I've got an opinion about things I understand, Mr. Thomas. I try not to have opinions about things I don't. That evening's dinner was quieter than the ride had been. Thomas cooked because he always cooked, and Evelyn watched him do it with an expression he couldn't quite read. You don't have to just sit there, he said, setting a plate in front of her. I'm observing. Observing what? How a kitchen runs when it's run by a man who's been alone a long time. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. That obvious. The salt's in 3 different places, Thomas. Nobody organizes a kitchen that way unless they've never had to share it with anyone. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he sat down across from her, and for a while they ate in silence. "You're not what I expected," he admitted finally. "You've said that already." "I mean it a second time." "Is that a complaint?" Thomas considered the question honestly before he answered. "No," he said. "I don't think it is." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, and then she looked back down at her plate. "Good," she said quietly. "Because I've got no intention of being simple Thomas Grayson. I hope you can live with that." He didn't answer right away. But something in him, something that had been asleep for 3 years buried under that cottonwood tree beside Sarah, stirred for the first time since he'd lost her. He didn't know yet if that was a good thing or a terrible one. He was about to find out. Thomas woke the next morning before sunrise, the way he always did, expecting the house to be as quiet and still as it had been every morning for 3 years. It wasn't. He heard sound coming from the kitchen before he'd even pulled his boots on the scrape of a pan, the crack of the stove being fed the low creak of the back door opening and closing. For one disoriented moment, still half asleep, he thought he was dreaming that somehow the house had gone back in time to when Sarah was still alive and moving through those same rooms. Then he remembered. He dressed quickly and came down to find Evelyn already at the stove sleeves rolled to her elbows, a fire built, and coffee already brewing, as though she'd lived in that kitchen her whole life, instead of one single night. "You're up early," he said, still adjusting to the sight of another person standing where he'd stood alone every morning since the funeral. "Ranch work doesn't wait for a decent hour," Evelyn said without turning around. "I assume you already knew that." "I did. I just didn't expect you to know it too." "I told you, I'm not delicate." She glanced at him over her shoulder, something almost like amusement in her expression. "Eggs or no eggs, I found 4 in the coop, though one of your hens looks like she's plotting something." "That'd be Bertha. She's been plotting since April." Evelyn actually laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, like she hadn't expected to find anything funny that morning, and was mildly annoyed that she had. Thomas found he liked the sound of it more than he wanted to admit. Breakfast passed easier than dinner had the night before. Evelyn asked practical questions: how many hands worked the ranch, what the daily routine looked like, where the nearest doctor was in case of emergency. And Thomas found himself answering more openly than he intended, drawn out by the straightforward way she asked. "You've got one hired man," she said. "Just the one. Silas. Been with me 8 years. Older fellow, doesn't say much, but there's nobody better with cattle in the territory." "Will he mind taking orders from a woman?" Thomas paused over his coffee. "Are you planning on giving him orders?" "I'm planning on being useful, Thomas. Sometimes usefulness looks like giving orders." He didn't have an answer for that, so he simply said, "You'll have to find out for yourself." She found out within the hour. Silas Cobb had worked Grayson land longer than most men stayed married, and he had exactly the opinion of mail-order brides that Thomas expected, which was to say none at all, until he had reason to form one. He was mending a section of fence near the north pasture when Evelyn approached, already dressed for work in a plain skirt and sturdy boots that told him she hadn't packed for decoration. "Morning," she said. "I'm Evelyn." Silas looked up, gave her a slow once-over that wasn't unkind, just thorough, and returned to his work. "Heard you'd arrived." "I did, yesterday." "You settling in all right?" "Well enough. I noticed your fence post there is rotted through at the base. You'll lose that whole section in the next hard wind if you don't replace it, not just patch it." Silas stopped what he was doing and looked at the post, then at her with an expression that suggested he wasn't sure whether to be offended or impressed. "You know fence work. I know rot when I see it." He studied her a moment longer, then grunted, which Thomas would later explain was as close to approval as Silas Cobb ever gave anybody on the first day of knowing them. "Well," Silas said, "if you know rot, you're welcome to fetch me a new post from the barn. Saves me the walk." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She turned and walked toward the barn without a word of complaint, and Silas watched her go with an expression Thomas hadn't seen on the old cowboy's face in years, something close to curiosity. "She's not what I figured," Silas said quietly once she was out of earshot. No, Thomas agreed. She's not. The real test came 4 days later, and it came fast, the way trouble on a ranch always did, without warning, without mercy, and exactly when nobody was prepared for it. It started with the horses. Thomas heard the commotion before he understood what was happening. A sharp, panicked whinny, the splintering crack of wood, and Silas's voice shouting something Thomas couldn't make out from the house. He was out the door and running before he'd even fully registered the sound of hooves pounding loose and wild across the yard. One of the young geldings, spooked by a rattlesnake in the grass near the corral, had bolted straight through a weak section of fence, the very section Evelyn had warned Silas about, and was now careening across the open field with a loose rail still tangled around its back legs, panicked and liable to break a leg, or worse if it didn't stop. "Thomas!" Silas shouted, already moving, but the horse was faster than either of them, cutting toward the tree line at a dead run. Thomas's heart lodged somewhere in his throat. A horse running like that, tangled in wood, could snap a leg in a single wrong step. Once that happened, there'd be no saving it. Then he saw Evelyn. She'd come from the garden skirts, hiked in one hand, moving not toward the horse, but at an angle to it, cutting across the field in a path that made no sense to Thomas until he understood a half-second later exactly what she was doing. She wasn't chasing the horse. She was getting ahead of it. "Evelyn, get back!" Thomas shouted, sprinting now, sure she was about to put herself directly in the path of a half-ton of panicked animal. She didn't get back. She reached a position just ahead of the gelding's path, planted her feet, and instead of running or screaming or throwing her hands up the way Thomas fully expected, she went still. Completely still. And she began to speak low, even steady, a stream of quiet words Thomas couldn't hear from that distance, but recognized the shape of instantly, because it was the exact same tone he used himself, the tone that had made half of Cedar Hollow believe he had some kind of gift with spooked animals. The horse's ears flicked toward her. Its stride faltered. It slowed, not stopped, not yet, but slowed enough that when it reached her, instead of running her down, it shied sideways, snorting wild-eyed, but no longer at a dead run. Evelyn moved with it, matching its sideways step, one hand rising slow and steady toward its neck, still talking in that same low murmur, until finally, impossibly, the gelding came to a trembling stop, with her hand resting flat against its shoulder. Thomas reached them a moment later, breathless, heart still pounding, and stared at her like he was seeing an entirely new person standing in front of him. "You could have been killed," he said, the words coming out rougher than he intended, more frightened than angry, though it sounded like anger. Evelyn didn't flinch from his tone. She kept her hand on the horse, kept her voice low and calm, even as she answered him. "I've done this before." "Where, with who?" "Thomas." Her eyes finally met his, and there was something behind them. Old pain, carefully guarded, that made him stop pushing, at least for the moment. "Not now. Please." Silas arrived a moment later, out of breath, and looked between the calm horse, the tangled fence rail now lying harmless on the ground, and Evelyn's steady hand with an expression of open astonishment. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "Woman's got a gift." Evelyn finally allowed herself to breathe, her hand still resting against the gelding's trembling neck. "He'll need that leg looked at. There's a cut above the fetlock." "I'll get the salve," Silas said, already moving. Thomas stayed where he was, watching Evelyn calm an animal that could have broken her in half without meaning to, and felt something shift inside his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Something dangerously close to the feeling he'd sworn he would never let himself feel again. That night, after the horse was tended, and the fence repaired, and the whole frightening ordeal had settled into something they could finally talk about over dinner, Thomas found himself watching Evelyn across the table in a way he hadn't allowed himself to watch anyone in 3 years. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "With the horse." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, turning her fork slowly against her plate. "My father kept horses," she said finally. "Fine ones, expensive ones. I spent more time in those stables than I ever did in drawing rooms, much to my mother's disappointment. Your mother wanted something different for you. My mother wanted a great many things for me that I had no interest in providing. There was an edge in her voice now, careful and controlled, but unmistakably there. Like what? Evelyn looked up at him, and for a moment Thomas thought she might actually answer honestly. Then something closed behind her eyes, some door sliding shut. Like a life I didn't choose, she said simply. That's all I'll say about it tonight, Thomas. Some things I'd rather leave back east where they belong. He wanted to push. He wanted to ask what kind of life, what kind of family, what kind of mother raised a daughter who could calm a stampeding horse but wouldn't speak her own family's name above a whisper. But he thought of his own walls, the ones he'd built around Sarah's memory, the ones he guarded just as fiercely, and he found he understood the instinct too well to falter for it. All right, he said instead. Some things stay back east. Relief passed visibly across her face, quick and quiet, and she reached across the table the first time she'd touched him since the handshake on the day she arrived, and pressed her hand briefly over his. Thank you, she said. Thomas looked down at her hand on his, then up at her face, and felt the last of his careful defenses tremble, like that fence rail the gelding had dragged loose across the field. He didn't say anything else that night. But he didn't sleep much either. Lying awake in the dark, listening to the quiet, unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in the room down the hall, and wondering for the first time in 3 years whether he was in more danger from this woman than any spooked horse could ever put him in. The trouble with secrets, Thomas would come to learn, was that they rarely stayed buried as deep as the people carrying them believed. It was nearly 2 weeks after the incident with the horse when the first crack showed. Evelyn had settled into ranch life with an ease that still occasionally startled him. She'd reorganized the kitchen within her first week, rearranged the garden into something that actually made sense. By her second and by the third she'd won over Silas so thoroughly that the old cowboy had started bringing her wildflowers from the north pasture, like an awkward schoolboy, which he steadfastly denied doing every single time Thomas teased him about it. The town had taken longer to come around, but even Mrs. Higgins had softened somewhat, mostly because Evelyn had a way of answering nosy questions so smoothly and pleasantly that the asker often didn't realize until much later that she'd told them absolutely nothing at all. It was laundry day when Thomas found the handkerchief. He hadn't meant to go through her things. He'd simply been gathering the wash from the line when the wind caught a small square of fine linen and sent it tumbling across the yard. He caught it without thinking, and it was only once it was in his hand that he registered what he was holding. It wasn't the plain cotton handkerchiefs Evelyn usually carried, the practical kind meant for ranch work. This one was fine linen, edged in delicate lace, monogrammed in the corner with 2 elegant embroidered initials. E.W., not E.H., not Evelyn Hart. Thomas stood in the yard holding that small square of fabric for a long moment, feeling something cold settle low in his stomach. He was still standing there when Evelyn came around the side of the house, her arms full of folded linens, and stopped dead at the sight of what he was holding. Her face went pale. Thomas. E.W., he said quietly, holding it up. Not Hart. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stage with her chin lifted and her eyes fearless. Thomas watched Evelyn Hart look genuinely frightened. It's an old handkerchief, she said too quickly. From before. It doesn't mean anything. It's got initials on it, Evelyn. Initials aren't nothing. Thomas, please. Who's E.W.? The silence that followed stretched long and taut, the kind of silence that Thomas had learned over 3 lonely years could hold more truth in it than any words. Evelyn's eyes searched his face, and for just a moment he saw something there he hadn't seen before. Not just guardedness, not just careful control, but real fear, the kind that came from somewhere far deeper than an ordinary secret. Please, she said again, softer this time. Not today. I'll explain. I promise you I will. Just not today. Every instinct in Thomas told him to push to demand an answer right there in the yard, with the wash still snapping on the line around them. But he looked at her face, really looked at it, and saw not a woman hiding something petty, but a woman standing at the edge of something that frightened her badly. He folded the handkerchief slowly and held it out to her. All right, he said. Not today. She took it from him with trembling fingers, and for a moment he thought she might actually cry. She didn't. She composed herself the way she seemed to compose herself through everything, straightened her shoulders, and walked past him into the house without another word. Thomas stood alone in the yard for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, feeling the ground beneath his careful, guarded life shift in a way he hadn't planned for and didn't know how to stop. He told himself it didn't matter. Whatever she was hiding, whoever EW was, it belonged to a life she'd left behind. Back east, buried the same way his own grief was buried under that cottonwood tree. He almost believed himself. He might have gone on believing himself if it weren't for what happened 3 days later, when a stranger rode into Cedar Hollow, asking questions about a woman who matched Evelyn's description down to the color of her eyes. A stranger who wasn't asking out of curiosity, but out of purpose. The way a man asks when he already knows exactly who he's looking for and has simply been waiting to find her. Thomas didn't hear about it until that evening when Walt rode out to the ranch himself, his expression grim in a way Thomas had rarely seen. "Thomas," Walt said, swinging down from his horse without his usual easy grin. "We need to talk. Alone." Behind him, through the kitchen window, Thomas could see Evelyn setting the table for dinner, humming softly to herself, entirely unaware that the past she'd tried so carefully to leave behind had just ridden into town looking for her. Thomas felt his stomach drop straight through the floor. "What is it?" he said, though some part of him already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Walt glanced toward the house, lowered his voice, and said the words that would change everything. "There's a man in town asking about your wife, Thomas, and he's not asking like a friend." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "My wife's been dead 3 years, Walt. You know that better than anybody." Walt winced, immediately realizing his mistake. "I don't mean Sarah. I mean hell, Thomas. I mean Evelyn. Man's asking around town about a woman matching her description. Dark hair, gray eyes came in on the stage from the east about 3 weeks back." The relief that came from realizing Walt hadn't meant Sarah lasted exactly 2 seconds before a colder fear replaced it. "What kind of man?" "Well-dressed. City clothes, city manners. Rode in on a horse that cost more than most men around here make in a year. Set himself up at the hotel, been asking questions at the general store, the bank, the telegraph office." "Asking what exactly?" "Whether anybody's seen a woman matching that description. Whether she came in alone or with anybody. Whether she's married." Walt's jaw tightened. He's not asking like a man looking for a lost relative, Thomas. He's asking like a man building a case. Thomas glanced back toward the house, toward the warm yellow light spilling from the kitchen window, toward the silhouette of Evelyn moving between the stove and the table, humming to herself, unaware that her past had just ridden into Cedar Hollow, wearing a fine coat and asking careful questions. Did he give a name? Wouldn't. Not to anybody. Paid the hotel clerk to keep quiet about it too, but you know Cedar Hollow. Nothing stays quiet here longer than a day. Thomas felt something hard settle behind his ribs. "What do you think he wants with her?" "I don't know, Thomas, but I know that handkerchief you found last week." Walt's eyes were steady, unflinching. "Nancy told me. She said you looked like a man who'd seen a ghost." "Nancy talks too much." "Nancy's my wife. Talking's half of what makes a marriage work." Walt stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "Whatever Evelyn's running from, it's caught up to her. You need to decide right now whether you're going to stand behind her or hand her over to whoever that man's working for." Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked at the house again, at the warm light, at the shape of a woman who'd calmed a stampeding horse with nothing but her voice and her steady hands, who'd rearranged his kitchen and won over his hired man and made his empty house feel like something worth coming home to for the first time in 3 years. "I don't hand people over, Walt," Thomas said quietly. "Not ever. Not to anybody." Walt studied him a moment longer, then nodded slowly, satisfaction and worry mixing in equal measure on his face. "Then you'd better find out what she's hiding before that man finds her first. Because if he gets to her before you know the truth, Thomas, you won't have any ground to stand on." Thomas walked Walt back to his horse in silence, his mind racing through everything that had happened over the last 3 weeks. The calm horse, the fine linen handkerchief, The way Evelyn's face had gone pale as paper when he'd asked about the initials, the way she'd begged him, please not today. Today had just become unavoidable. He found her in the kitchen exactly where he'd left her in his mind, setting the last plate on the table, wiping her hands on her apron, looking up at him with an easy smile that faltered the instant she saw his face. "Thomas? What's wrong? We need to talk." The smile disappeared entirely. She set down the dish towel, slowly, deliberately, the way a person moves when they're buying themselves a few extra seconds to prepare for something they've been dreading. "Is this about the handkerchief?" "It's about a man in town asking questions about a woman who sounds exactly like you." Evelyn went very still. "What kind of questions?" "Whether anybody's seen you, whether you're married, whether you came here alone." Thomas kept his voice level, though everything in him wanted to demand answers immediately. Well-dressed Walt said, "City manners, paying people to keep quiet." The color that had been slowly returning to Evelyn's face after the horse incident, after weeks of sun and ranch work, drained away in an instant. "Oh God," she whispered. "Evelyn." "I need to sit down." She didn't wait for permission. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands pressed flat against the table, like she needed something solid to hold on to. Thomas sat across from her, forcing patience he didn't feel. "Who is he?" Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, though she hadn't let a single tear fall. "His name is Edward Winslow," she said. "He works for my father." "Winslow." Thomas turned the name over. "The initials. E.W." "No." Evelyn shook her head quickly. "Not his. Mine. My real name isn't Evelyn Hart Thomas. It's Evelyn Whitmore." The name hit him harder than he expected, though he didn't yet understand why. "Whitmore," he repeated slowly. "My father is Charles Whitmore Sr. You may have heard of the family. We own—" She stopped. Herself swallowed hard, started again. "We owned shipping interests up and down the eastern seaboard. Railroads, some banking investments. It doesn't matter what we owned. What matters is that my father is a very powerful man, and very powerful men do not take kindly to their daughters running away." Thomas felt the floor of his careful, quiet life shifting again beneath him. Running away from what? Evelyn's hands trembled against the table. "From a marriage I never agreed to." "You were engaged. I was promised." The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. "There's a difference, Thomas. Engaged implies I had a choice in the matter. I was promised the way you'd promise a piece of property to settle a business arrangement because that's exactly what it was. My father owed a debt to a man named Josiah Reeves, a debt too large to pay in cash, so he offered the next best thing he had." "You? Me?" The word came out flat exhausted, like she'd said it to herself 1,000 times already. "Josiah Reeves is 51 years old, Thomas. He buried 2 wives already, and everyone in Boston whispers about how the second one died so conveniently right after she inherited her family's fortune and signed it over to him. I was to be his 3rd wife. My father's debt would be forgiven. Reeves would get a young, presentable wife to parade at his business dinners, and I would spend the rest of my life terrified of ending up exactly like the 2 women who came before me." Thomas felt something cold and furious settle low in his stomach. "And your father agreed to this?" "My father arranged it himself." Evelyn's voice cracked slightly on the word father. "I fought him for months. I told him I wouldn't do it, that I'd rather work as a seamstress, a governess, anything than marry a man who frightened me the way Josiah Reeves frightened me. My father told me I was being dramatic. He told me every young bride feels nervous before her wedding, and that in time I would learn to appreciate the security Reeves could provide. He didn't believe you. He didn't want to believe me, because believing me would have meant admitting he was selling his own daughter to settle a debt." Evelyn wiped angrily at her eyes, refusing to let the tears actually fall. "The wedding was set for early spring. I had 3 weeks left before I would have become Mrs. Josiah Reeves, and I couldn't do it, Thomas. I couldn't stand at that altar and watch my whole life disappear into that man's hands. So you ran. I found the mail order agency's advertisement in a newspaper I wasn't even supposed to be reading. I wrote to them in secret, using a false name, arranged everything without my mother or my father knowing a single detail. And 3 days before the wedding, I packed one suitcase and disappeared. Thomas sat back, slowly absorbing everything, watching the woman across the table transform in his understanding from a mysterious stranger with secrets into someone who had fought, actually fought for the right to choose her own life. The same fight he suspected very few people in her position ever won. "And this Edward Winslow," Thomas said quietly. "He's here to bring you back. He's here to find me and report back to my father exactly where I am and who I'm with." Fresh fear tightened Evelyn's face. "Thomas, if my father learns where I am, he won't come alone. He'll come with Josiah Reeves, and Reeves has never lost anything he considered his in his entire life. He'll fight for me the same way he'd fight for a piece of land or a shipping contract, because that's exactly what I am to him, property. He can't force you into a marriage, Evelyn. Not out here, not against your will. You don't know men like Josiah Reeves." Evelyn's laugh was bitter hollow. "He doesn't need force, Thomas. He needs paperwork. My father can have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs, unstable, hysterical. There are doctors who'll sign whatever document a man like my father pays them to sign. He can have me committed, or he can simply drag me back to Boston by whatever legal means money can buy. And once I'm there won't be a single person who'll believe a runaway bride over a respected businessman and his grieving, worried family." Thomas felt fury building in his chest, sharp and protective, in a way he hadn't felt about anything since Sarah's death. "That's not going to happen," he said. "You don't know that. I know that as long as you're standing on my property under my roof wearing—" He stopped himself before he could say the word wife, though it had been sitting on his tongue ready before he even realized it. "As long as you're here, Evelyn, nobody is taking you anywhere against your will. I don't care whose father he is." Evelyn stared at him, something raw and disbelieving crossing her face. "Why would you do that? You barely know me. You didn't even want a wife who'd cause you trouble, and I'm about to bring an enormous amount of trouble to your door." "I didn't want a wife who'd lie to me," Thomas said carefully. "That's different from trouble." The words landed harder than he intended. Evelyn flinched like she'd been struck. "I didn't lie to protect myself, Thomas. I lied because I was terrified, and because I genuinely believed the less you knew, the safer you'd be if my father ever did find me. If Edward Winslow walks away tonight, thinking there's nothing here worth reporting, this ends. If he finds out you know everything, if he finds out you're protecting me, then he finds out I'm protecting my wife," Thomas said, and this time he didn't stop the word. "Because that's what you are, Evelyn. On paper, in front of God, in front of this whole territory. Wife. And I don't hand over what's mine." Evelyn's breath caught audibly. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, the weight of the words sitting between them, changing something in the air of that small kitchen. "You barely know me," she whispered again, but softer this time, less like an accusation, and more like a plea for him to reconsider something she desperately hoped he wouldn't. "I know you calmed a stampeding horse with nothing but your voice," Thomas said. "I know you rearranged my whole kitchen in a week and made this house feel like a home for the first time in 3 years. I know you fought a father who tried to sell you off like cattle, and instead of breaking you, built a whole new life for yourself, 2,000 miles from everything you knew." He held her gaze steadily. "I know enough, Evelyn." Evelyn's composure finally cracked. A single tear slipped free, and she wiped it away, roughly embarrassed, though Thomas found he didn't mind seeing it at all. It made her seem less like the composed stranger who'd stepped off the stage, and more like someone real, someone who'd been carrying an unbearable weight alone for far too long. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. "First, we find out exactly what Edward Winslow knows. Then we decide how to handle it." They didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, Edward Winslow rode out to the Grayson Ranch himself. Thomas saw the fine black horse coming up the road from a distance and felt his stomach tighten immediately. Silas, working near the barn, straightened at the sight of an unfamiliar rider dressed far too well for ranch business, and Thomas caught his eye across the yard, a silent understanding passing between them. "Get Evelyn inside," Thomas said quietly. "Keep her there until I say otherwise." Silas nodded once and moved toward the house without another word. Thomas met the rider at the edge of the yard, positioning himself deliberately between the approaching stranger and the house behind him. "Afternoon," Thomas said, his voice carefully neutral. "Help you with something." The man who dismounted was younger than Thomas expected, perhaps 30, dressed in a fine gray coat, entirely unsuited to Montana dust, with the careful, watchful eyes of a man accustomed to gathering information for people who paid him well to gather it. "Edward Winslow," the man said, extending a hand. Thomas didn't take. "I'm looking for information about a woman who may have recently arrived in this area. Dark hair, gray eyes, likely traveling under a false name. Lot of women fit that description, Mr. Winslow. This one would have arrived roughly 3 weeks ago, possibly through a matrimonial agency." Winslow's eyes moved past Thomas toward the house, sharp and assessing. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, Mr. Grayson?" Thomas didn't offer anything further. "Mr. Grayson." Winslow's smile was thin, professional, entirely without warmth. "I represent a family of significant standing back east. Their daughter went missing under distressing circumstances, and they're understandably desperate to ensure her safety." "Sounds like the family should be worried about why their daughter felt the need to go missing in the first place," Thomas said. Something flickered across Winslow's face, surprise quickly masked. "I beg your pardon. I said sounds like a family that ought to be asking itself some hard questions, instead of paying men to hunt down a grown woman like she's a runaway horse." Winslow's expression cooled considerably. "Mr. Grayson, I don't believe you understand the seriousness of this situation. The young woman in question is not thinking clearly. She's been under a great deal of strain, and her family fears for her well-being. Doctors have expressed concern about her state of mind." "Doctors her father paid for, I'd guess." Winslow's jaw tightened. "You seem to know a great deal about a woman you claim not to know at all, Mr. Grayson." Thomas held the man's gaze steadily, refusing to give an inch. "I know plenty about men who show up uninvited asking questions they've got no right to ask. That's all I know." "Is she here?" Winslow's voice sharpened, all pretense of polite conversation dropping away. "I have reason to believe the woman I'm searching for is on this property, Mr. Grayson. I'd advise you to think very carefully about the consequences of obstructing a family's legitimate search for a missing daughter. And I'd advise you to get off my land," Thomas said, his voice going low and hard in a way that made even Winslow take an involuntary step back. "Before I stop being polite about asking." For a long, tense moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the air between them crackling with unspoken threat. Then from the direction of the house a voice rang out. "Edward!" Thomas's stomach dropped straight through the floor. Evelyn stood on the porch, having ignored Silas's attempt to keep her inside. Her chin lifted, her spine straight, facing the man who'd hunted her across half a continent with the same fearless composure she'd shown stepping off that stage 3 weeks earlier. Winslow's face transformed relief, satisfaction, and something colder underneath it all. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Your father will be very relieved to know you're alive and well. Tell my father—" Evelyn said, her voice steady, despite the visible tremor in her hands, "that I am alive, I am well, and I am never coming back to Boston. Miss Whitmore, please be reasonable. Your father is beside himself with worry. Mr. Reeves has delayed the wedding out of respect for the circumstances, but his patience—" "Dans, his patience is not my concern," Evelyn cut in sharply. "I am not going to marry Josiah Reeves Edward. Not now, not ever. You may report that back exactly as I've said it." Winslow's composure finally slipped, frustration bleeding through the careful professional mask. "You don't understand what you're doing. Your father has resources, Miss Whitmore. Legal resources. If you refuse to return voluntarily, then he'll do what—" Thomas interrupted, stepping forward, positioning himself squarely between Winslow and the porch. Drag a grown woman back across 2,000 miles against her will. I'd like to see him try. And I'd like to see the judge who signs off on it once I've told this territory exactly what kind of debt her father was trying to settle by selling his own daughter to a man who's already buried 2 wives. Winslow's face went pale. That is a vicious and unfounded accusation, he said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Is it? Thomas kept his voice hard, unyielding. Because from where I'm standing, Mr. Winslow, it sounds like a family with a whole lot to hide sending a hired man 2,000 miles to threaten a woman who had the courage to save her own life. You go on and report that back to Boston, too. Winslow looked between Thomas and Evelyn, calculation visibly working behind his eyes, weighing his options with the cold precision of a man accustomed to solving problems for people who paid him well. This isn't finished, he said, finally swinging back up onto his horse. Mr. Whitmore will not simply accept his daughter running off with some frontier rancher. He'll send someone with more authority than I carry. Perhaps Mr. Reeves himself will come see to this matter personally. The threat hung in the air, deliberate and pointed. Let him come. Thomas set his voice steady despite the cold dread the words sent through him. Whoever shows up next, they'll find the same answer waiting for them. Winslow held his gaze a moment longer, then turned his horse and rode away without another word, leaving behind a silence so thick Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Evelyn came down off the porch slowly, her earlier composure finally beginning to crack now that the confrontation was over. Thomas crossed the yard to meet her, catching her by the shoulders as her legs seemed to genuinely give out beneath her. He'll come back, she whispered, gripping his arms like they were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted sideways. Or worse, my father will send Josiah Reeves himself. Let him. Thomas, you don't understand what kind of man Reeves is. He doesn't lose, not ever, not to anybody, and certainly not to some Montana rancher standing between him and something he considers already his. I don't lose either, Evelyn. Thomas held her steady, meeting her frightened eyes with a calm he didn't entirely feel, but forced into his voice regardless. Not when it matters, and you matter. Something in her expression shifted, fear still there, but something else beginning to grow alongside it. Something that looked almost like hope, fragile and disbelieving. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you fight for me like this? You could send me away right now. Tell Winslow you want nothing to do with any of it, and none of this would touch you at all. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, searching for words honest enough to match the moment. Because for 3 years, he said finally, I told myself I didn't want anybody in my life who could hurt me, the way losing Sarah hurt me. I built walls so high I forgot what it felt like to actually care about somebody's safety, somebody's happiness, somebody's whole entire life. He tightened his grip on her shoulders gently. 3 weeks ago, you stepped off that stage and started tearing those walls down without even trying to. I'm not about to hand you over to a man who wants to own you like property, Evelyn. Not when I'm just now remembering what it feels like to actually live again. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears she finally allowed to fall, and for the first time since her arrival, she leaned into him instead of standing carefully apart, her forehead resting against his chest, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt, like she was afraid the ground might disappear beneath her if she let go. Thomas wrapped his arms around her slowly, carefully, like she was something precious and fragile, despite every bit of evidence he'd seen over the last 3 weeks that she was neither. I'm scared, Thomas, she admitted quietly, her voice muffled against his chest. I know. I've never let myself be scared in front of anybody before, not once, not even when I ran. You don't have to keep doing this alone anymore, Evelyn. They stood like that for a long time, the yard quiet around them, the threat of Edward Winslow's departing warning still hanging heavy in the air. But for just a moment, neither of them acknowledged it. For just a moment, there was only the two of them and the fragile, dangerous, undeniable thing growing steadily between them. It was Silas who broke the moment, clearing his throat loudly from the porch, one eyebrow raised in an expression that was somewhere between amused and deeply satisfied. Well, the old cowboy said, reckon that answers whether you two are actually married or just pretending at it for the neighbors. Evelyn pulled back quickly, cheeks flushing, though Thomas noticed she didn't pull far. Silas? Ain't my business, Silas said, holding up his hands, though the grin on his weathered face suggested he found the whole situation thoroughly entertaining. Just glad to see you two finally figured out what the rest of us been seeing for a week now. Thomas felt heat rise up his own neck, though he found he didn't mind Silas's teasing nearly as much as he expected to. But the moment of levity didn't last. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling, Winslow's parting threat replaying over and over in his mind. Perhaps Mr. Reeves himself will come see to this matter personally. He heard soft footsteps in the hallway sometime past midnight, and a moment later a quiet knock at his door. Thomas. Evelyn's voice hesitant, uncertain. Are you awake? He rose immediately and opened the door to find her standing there in the dim light, wrapped in a shawl, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, alone in the dark. Couldn't sleep either, he said, though it wasn't really a question. I keep thinking about what happens if he actually comes. Reeves, I mean. Her voice trembled. I keep thinking about what I'll do if I have to choose between running again and watching you get hurt trying to protect me. Nobody's running anywhere, Evelyn. You don't know him, Thomas. You don't know what he's capable of. She wrapped her arms around herself, the shawl doing little to stop her visible trembling. There were rumors back in Boston about his first two wives. Nobody could ever prove anything, but the rumors were enough that half of society avoided him for a full year after the second one died, before the money made everyone conveniently forget. Thomas felt cold fury settle in his chest at the thought of a man like that laying any claim to Evelyn at all. Come here, he said quietly, opening the door wider. Evelyn hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, and Thomas guided her to sit beside him at the edge of the bed, close enough that their shoulders touched close enough that he could feel her trembling gradually begin to still. I promise you. He said, his voice low and steady in the darkness. As long as I'm breathing, that man is never laying a hand on you, not while you're standing on my land wearing my name. You can't promise that, Thomas. You can't control what a man like Josiah Reeves decides to do. No, Thomas agreed. But I can control what I do to stop him. Evelyn turned to look at him in the dim moonlight, filtering through the window. Her expression searching, cautious, like she was trying to determine whether she could actually allow herself to believe him. 3 weeks ago, she said softly, I stepped off that stage terrified that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd traded one kind of prison for another, that I'd find myself trapped out here just as surely as I would have been trapped back in Boston. And now, her hand found his in the darkness, fingers lacing together slowly, carefully, like she was testing whether the connection would hold. Now I think, she whispered, that I found something I never even knew I was looking for. Thomas turned his hand to hold hers properly, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. What's that? Somebody who'd actually fight for me. Not because of what I could bring him, not because of my father's money or my family's name. Her voice cracked slightly. Just because he decided I was worth fighting for. You are, Thomas said simply without hesitation. You are worth fighting for Evelyn. The space between them had grown small enough that Thomas could feel her breath against his cheek, could see the way her eyes searched his face. In the pale moonlight, could feel the same dangerous pull he'd been fighting since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach 3 weeks earlier. Neither of them moved for a long, suspended moment. Then Evelyn leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips to his, in a kiss that was hesitant at first, uncertain, before deepening into something neither of them had the strength left to resist. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Evelyn rested her forehead against his, her hand still gripping his tightly. I should be terrified right now, she whispered. There's a man hunting me across half the country who won't stop until he either drags me back to Boston or ruins everything I've tried to build here. And instead, all I can think about is how safe I feel sitting right here beside you. That's not a coincidence, Evelyn. No, she agreed softly. I don't suppose it is. They sat together in the darkness for a long while. After that, neither speaking, simply holding on to each other against a threat that both of them knew was far from finished. The next morning brought no relief. If anything, it brought worse. Thomas rode into Cedar Hollow at first light to check on any word from Winslow, and found the town buzzing with an entirely different kind of trouble. Thomas. Walt caught him outside the general store, his expression grim in a way that made Thomas's stomach drop immediately. You need to see this. He handed over a newspaper freshly arrived on the morning stage, a Boston paper 3 weeks old, but clearly still relevant to whoever had sent it west with such urgency. Thomas scanned the front page, and his blood ran cold. Whitmore heiress missing family offers substantial reward for information leading to safe return. Fiancé Josiah Reeves declares, I will not rest until my beloved Evelyn is found and brought home safely. Below the headline, a photograph, Evelyn dressed in fine silk. Her hair elaborately styled, standing beside a heavy-set older man, Thomas immediately understood to be Josiah Reeves, his hand possessively at her waist, his smile predatory, even in grainy newspaper print. There's more, Walt said quietly, watching Thomas's face carefully. Rewards substantial, Thomas. $5,000 for information. That kind of money's already got half the territory talking. Somebody's bound to put the pieces together eventually, especially with Winslow already sniffing around asking questions. Thomas felt the paper crumple slightly in his tightening grip. $5,000? He repeated numbly. That was more money than most families in Cedar Hollow would see in 5 years combined. More than enough to turn even good neighbors into people willing to sell information for the right price. There's something else, Walt said, his voice dropping lower still. Word is Reeves himself is already on his way west, left Boston 4 days ago by private rail car. Man's not waiting around for Winslow's reports anymore. He's coming to collect what he considers his property personally. Thomas stared at the newspaper photograph one more time. Evelyn's face, carefully composed, betraying nothing of the fear he now understood, had been hiding behind that practiced expression, Reeves's possessive hand at her waist, like she was already something he owned. When's he expected to arrive? Nobody knows exactly. Could be days. Could be less. Walt's expression was grave. Thomas, whatever you're planning to do, you'd better do it fast. Because once a man like Josiah Reeves gets here, and once this whole territory knows there's a $5,000 reward sitting on your ranch, you're not just fighting one hired investigator anymore. Thomas looked up from the newspaper, dread and determination warring equally in his chest. What am I fighting then? Walt's answer came grim and certain. You're fighting everybody who ever wanted $5,000 more than they wanted to do the right thing, Thomas. And out here, that might be more people than you'd like to think. Josiah Reeves arrived in Cedar Hollow 6 days later, and the whole town knew it within the hour. He didn't come quietly. He came with 2 private rail cars uncoupled at the depot, 4 hired men trailing him like shadows, and a black carriage that looked entirely wrong, parked outside the town's modest hotel, gleaming and expensive against the dust of every ordinary wagon around it. Thomas heard about it from Silas, who'd ridden hard from town the moment the train pulled in, his weathered face tight with urgency. He's here, Silas said, swinging down from his horse before it had even fully stopped. Big man's silver hair moves like he owns whatever ground he's standing on, already asking the hotel clerk where the Grayson Ranch sits. Thomas felt his stomach clench, though he'd been expecting this moment for 6 days, bracing for it every night since the newspaper photograph had burned itself into his memory. How long till he gets here? Hour, maybe less if he don't waste time settling in first. Evelyn had gone pale the moment she heard her hands twisting the fabric of her apron with a nervous energy Thomas hadn't seen from her since her first night on the ranch. I need to see him, she said suddenly. Thomas turned sharply. No, Thomas, if I hide from him, if I let him think I'm afraid to face him, he'll only push harder. I know how Josiah operates. He respects strength. He despises weakness. If I run and hide in this house like a frightened child, he'll treat me like one for the rest of whatever fight this becomes. He's dangerous, Evelyn. I know exactly how dangerous he is. Better than you do." Her chin lifted that same fearless composure she'd worn stepping off the stagecoach 3 weeks earlier, settling back over her features like armor. "But I've spent my entire life being dangerous men's property. I won't spend one more day cowering from one not even Josiah Reeves, not on this land, not standing beside you." Thomas studied her for a long moment, torn between the fierce need to protect her and the growing understanding that Evelyn Whitmore had never once needed rescuing. She needed someone willing to stand beside her while she fought her own battle. "All right," he said finally. "But you don't face him alone, not for 1 second." She nodded, gripping his hand tightly. Not alone. Never again. Reeves arrived exactly 55 minutes later, his carriage rolling up the ranch road in a cloud of dust. 4 hired men on horseback flanking it like an honor guard for a man who clearly believed he deserved one. Thomas stood in the yard waiting Evelyn beside him. Silas a few steps back with a shotgun that wasn't quite pointed at anyone, but wasn't exactly hidden either. The carriage door opened and Josiah Reeves stepped down. He was exactly as the newspaper photograph suggested, heavy-set, silver-haired, dressed in a coat that cost more than most Cedar Hollow families earned in a year. His face carrying the particular soft cruelty of a man who'd never once been told no, and meant it. His eyes found Evelyn immediately, and something proprietary flickered across his expression, something that made Thomas's fists clench involuntarily at his sides. "Evelyn." Reeves's voice was smooth-cultured, carrying the false warmth of a man used to getting his way through charm before he ever resorted to force. "My dear girl, do you have any idea what worry you've caused your family? I've caused my family exactly the amount of worry they deserve for trying to sell me to you." Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the visible tension in her shoulders. Reeves's smile didn't waver, though something colder passed behind his eyes. "Such dramatic language. I understand you've had quite an adventure out here playing at frontier life. Charming, really, in its own way. But surely you understand it's time to come home now." "This is my home. This." Reeves gestured dismissively at the ranch around him. "The barn. The modest house, the working land." Thomas had spent his entire adult life building is a temporary fantasy, my dear. A young woman's rebellion, and I understand it truly, I do. But you belong in Boston. You belong in silk, not homespun. You belong at my side, hosting dinners for senators and railroad men, not scrubbing floors for some frontier rancher. I'd rather scrub floors for the rest of my life than spend one more hour in a room with you," Evelyn said flatly. The false warmth in Reeves's expression finally cracked just slightly, just enough for Thomas to glimpse the man underneath, cold, calculating, dangerous, in a way that had nothing to do with physical violence, and everything to do with the kind of power that could crush a person's entire life, through paperwork and money alone. "You'll want to be careful how you speak to me, Evelyn," Reeves said, his voice dropping lower, losing its cultured warmth entirely. "I've been remarkably patient through this entire embarrassing episode. My patience, I assure you, is not unlimited." "Your patience isn't required," Thomas said, stepping forward, positioning himself deliberately between Reeves and Evelyn. "She's told you her answer. I'd suggest you respect it and head back to that fancy rail car of yours." Reeves's eyes shifted to Thomas for the first time, sweeping over him with an assessment that felt like being appraised for slaughter. "And you would be the rancher, I presume, Mr. Grayson." Reeves's smile returned thin and mocking. "I confess I expected someone more impressive given how thoroughly you've disrupted a very important arrangement." "I didn't disrupt anything. Evelyn made her own choice." "Evelyn?" Reeves said, his voice taking on the patient, condescending tone of a man explaining something simple to a child, does not fully understand the consequences of her choices. "She's a sheltered young woman who's had her head turned by frontier romance and the novelty of playing at hard work. I don't blame you for taking advantage of that confusion, Mr. Grayson, but I think it's time we brought this fantasy to its natural conclusion." "Get off my land," Thomas said, his voice going hard and flat. Reeves studied him for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his eyes, the look of a man recalculating his approach rather than a man backing down. "Your land," Reeves repeated slowly, And something in the way he said it sent a fresh chill through Thomas's chest. Yes, about that. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, extending it toward Thomas, with the same false pleasantness he'd used throughout the entire conversation. What is this? A small matter I thought you should be aware of before this conversation goes any further. Reeves's smile had turned genuinely predatory now, all pretense of civility gone. I took the liberty before leaving Boston of purchasing your ranch's mortgage from the territorial bank that holds it. A simple business transaction. Banks are always eager to sell debt to a buyer willing to pay above market value, and I was, shall we say, highly motivated. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. Cold dread spreading through his chest as he unfolded the document with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady. It was real. Official bank letterhead, his own signature copied from the original loan documents he'd signed 6 years earlier when he'd expanded the herd, transferred now into a new holder's name, Josiah Reeves. You bought my mortgage, Thomas said numbly. I bought your mortgage, Reeves confirmed pleasantly. Which means, Mr. Grayson, that I now hold the note on this entire property. Every acre, every head of cattle you've mortgaged against it. And I regret to inform you that the payment schedule I intend to enforce will be considerably more aggressive than whatever generous terms the Territorial Bank previously extended to you. Evelyn's face had gone white with fury and fear both. You can't do this. I already have, my dear. Reeves's eyes flicked to her with something almost affectionate, the affection of a man admiring a particularly satisfying move in a game he was confident he'd already won. It's remarkably simple, actually, once you understand how these things work. Mr. Grayson's ranch was already carrying significant debt. All it required was a buyer willing to purchase that debt and then call the full balance due immediately, as is my legal right as the new note holder. That's extortion, Thomas said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. That's business, Mr. Grayson. I do apologize that you're unfamiliar with how it works out here on the frontier, but I assure you the paperwork is entirely legitimate. Reeves's smile widened. You have 30 days to satisfy the full balance of your mortgage, or I will be forced to foreclose and take possession of this property in its entirety. Unless, of course, we can reach some other arrangement. What arrangement? Evelyn said, though her voice suggested she already knew exactly what he meant. You return to Boston with me willingly and marry me as originally arranged, Reeves said simply, and I will consider forgiving Mr. Grayson's debt entirely as a wedding gift to my bride. A generous offer, I think, given the circumstances. The silence that followed felt like the entire ranch had stopped breathing. Thomas stared at the document in his hands at his own signature, staring back at him from 6 years earlier at a debt he'd worked every single day since to pay down, honestly now weaponized into a trap specifically designed to force Evelyn's hand. You'd take everything I've built, Thomas said slowly, just to force her back into a marriage she doesn't want. I'd remind you, Mr. Grayson, that everything you've built exists on land purchased with money you borrowed and haven't yet fully repaid. Reeves said, his tone almost gentle now, almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. I'm simply exercising my legal rights as the current holder of that debt. Nothing more sinister than ordinary business. This isn't business, Evelyn snapped. This is you using a mortgage as a weapon because you can't stand losing something you consider yours. You are mine, Reeves said, and for the first time, real anger flashed across his composed features. You were promised to me, Evelyn. Your father gave his word, and your father's word settles a debt that's been owed for 2 years. I don't care how many frontier ranches you hide behind. You will honor that agreement, or I will personally ensure that Mr. Grayson loses everything he's ever worked for, and you will watch it happen, knowing you could have prevented it with a single word. Thomas felt Evelyn's hand find his gripping tight enough to hurt, and he understood immediately what she was fighting against, not just fear for herself, but the unbearable weight of knowing her choice might cost him everything. Don't, Thomas said quietly before she could speak. Whatever you're about to say, Evelyn, don't. Thomas, he'll take your land, everything you've worked for. Land can be rebuilt, it's just dirt and fences. Thomas turned to face her, fully ignoring Reeves entirely, for the moment his voice low and urgent. "You are not a debt to be settled, Evelyn. You are not a bargaining chip. I will not let you sacrifice yourself to save a ranch, not when there's another way through this." "What other way, Thomas?" Her voice cracked with desperation. "He owns the mortgage. 30 days and it's gone, everything you've built since you were a young man, all because of me." "Then we find 30 days worth of a fight," Thomas said fiercely. "We don't hand you over like property. Not to him, not to anybody." Reeves watched this exchange with an expression of mild, condescending amusement, as though observing two children arguing over something he'd already determined the outcome of. "How touching," he said dryly. "But sentiment doesn't satisfy a mortgage balance, Mr. Grayson. You have 30 days. I suggest you use them wisely." He turned back toward his carriage, then paused, looking back over his shoulder with a final cutting remark. "Oh, and Mr. Grayson, do be careful who you trust with this information in the meantime. Money changes people's loyalties remarkably quickly out here in the territories. I'd hate for you to be surprised by who else decides that $5,000 is worth more than whatever affection they claim to hold for you or Miss Whitmore." The threat hung in the air long after his carriage had disappeared back down the road toward town, dust settling slowly over the yard, leaving behind a silence heavier than anything Thomas had felt since Sarah's funeral. "Thomas," Evelyn's voice trembled. "I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't come here, if I hadn't dragged all of this—" "Stop." Thomas turned to face her, fully taking her by the shoulders. "I don't regret a single day since you stepped off that stage, Evelyn. Not one. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Not because you owe me something, but because that's what I choose." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. She finally let fall freely. "I don't know how to fight a man like Josiah Reeves Thomas. He has money lawyers' connections that reach into every corner of Boston society. What do we have?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through everything Reeves had said, every carefully calculated threat, searching for the crack in an otherwise airtight trap. Then something clicked into place. "We have 30 days, he said slowly, "and we have a mortgage document that was purchased through a bank transaction that happened suspiciously fast for a man who only learned about this ranch's existence a week ago." Evelyn looked up, confusion cutting through her tears. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Evelyn, that buying a mortgage from a territorial bank isn't as simple as Reeves made it sound. Banks don't sell debt overnight to strangers, not without paperwork, not without the borrower's notification, not without proper legal transfer procedures that take weeks, sometimes months." Thomas felt something sharpen inside him. The same steady focus he brought to calming a spooked animal now turned toward a very different kind of danger. Reeves showed up here with that document less than a week after that newspaper story ran. That's not ordinary business, Evelyn. That's a man who either had help moving faster than any legitimate transaction should move, or a man who's not being entirely honest about how legitimate that document actually is. Evelyn's tears slowed as understanding dawned across her face. "You think it's fraudulent?" "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that a man confident enough to threaten a woman's entire future with a piece of paper might also be confident enough to cut corners getting that paper in the first place. And if he cut corners, Evelyn, then somewhere in this territory there's a banker or a land agent who knows exactly how that document came to exist so fast." Hope flickered fragile and uncertain in Evelyn's expression. "How do we find out?" "We start with the only man in this territory who'd have handled the actual paperwork," Thomas said grimly. "Harlan Voss runs the territorial land office in the county seat. If Reeves needed local help making this happen fast, Voss is exactly the kind of man who'd take money to make it happen." They rode out at first light the next morning, leaving Silas behind to watch the ranch, both of them aware that every hour of their 30-day window mattered now more than ever. The county seat sat 2 hours north, a larger town than Cedar Hollow, home to the territorial land office and the kind of officials who handled the paperwork that made or broke a rancher's entire livelihood. Harlan Voss's office sat above the general store, And the man himself proved exactly as unpleasant as Thomas had expected, thin, nervous sweating despite the cool morning air, his eyes darting toward the door every few seconds, as though expecting trouble to walk through it at any moment. "Grayson?" Voss's voice cracked slightly on the name. "Wasn't expecting you." "I'd imagine not," Thomas said, closing the office door firmly behind him and Evelyn. "Given that you helped a man named Josiah Reeves purchase my mortgage sometime in the last 6 days. Voss's face went several shades paler. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Voss." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I recognize panic when I see it. My father employed men exactly like you for years, men willing to sign whatever document put money in their pocket, right up until the moment somebody with more power than they had walked through the door and started asking uncomfortable questions." "I haven't done anything illegal," Voss said, though his trembling hand suggested otherwise. "Then you won't mind showing us the proper documentation," Thomas said. "Bank transfer records, notifications sent to me as the original borrower which territorial law requires before any mortgage sale. Signed authorization from the bank's board approving the transfer." Voss's silence stretched long enough to answer the question before he ever opened his mouth. "There wasn't time for all that," he finally admitted, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Reeves offered considerable money cash, more than I make in 3 years combined, and he needed the paperwork completed quickly. He said the delay would cost him an important business opportunity." "So you forged the notification," Thomas said flatly. "I didn't forge anything." Voss's voice rose in panic. "I simply expedited the paperwork, backdated a few signatures that would have come through eventually anyway once the bank board formally approved everything." "You forged official documents," Evelyn said, "to help a man illegally seize property that wasn't legally his to seize yet." Voss's face had gone from pale to genuinely gray. "If this gets out, I'll lose my position. Possibly face criminal charges." "Please, Mr. Grayson, I have a family. You should have thought about your family before you took Josiah Reeves's money to steal mine." Thomas said, his voice hard as flint. "I can fix this," Voss said desperately. "I can void the transfer, restore the mortgage to its original bank holding, buy you time to sort this out properly. Please just don't report this to the territorial authorities. I'll lose everything." Thomas glanced at Evelyn, a silent question passing between them. "Void it," Thomas said finally. "Restore my mortgage to the bank exactly as it stood before Reeves ever touched it. And you're going to give us a signed statement detailing exactly what Reeves paid you to do and how fast you did it. He'll ruin me if he finds out I turned on him. He'll ruin you regardless the moment he doesn't need you anymore," Evelyn said quietly. "Men like Josiah Reeves don't keep loyal accomplices around once their usefulness runs out, Mr. Voss. I've watched him discard people exactly like you my entire life. Your only real protection now is making sure the truth comes out before he decides you're a liability." Voss's shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight visibly draining out of him. "I'll write the statement," he said quietly. "God help me, I'll write it all down." They rode back to Cedar Hollow that evening, with Voss's signed confession folded carefully in Thomas's coat pocket. A fragile weapon against a man with far more resources and far less conscience than any of them. "This proves fraud," Evelyn said as they rode, though worry still colored her voice. "But Thomas Reeves has lawyers, powerful ones. A confession from a frightened land agent might not be enough to stop a man with his connections." "It's enough to buy us time," Thomas said. "Enough to take to the territorial marshal, enough to file a formal complaint that at minimum freezes the mortgage transfer while it's investigated. That's 30 days we don't lose immediately. And if Reeves finds out what we've done before we can act on it..." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Then we'll have a much bigger problem than a fraudulent mortgage." They arrived back at the ranch well after dark, exhausted, cautiously hopeful for the first time since Reeves's carriage had rolled up that dusty road. That hope lasted exactly as long as it took them to see the smoke. "Thomas?" Evelyn's scream cut through the darkness as they crested the final hill, and Thomas's heart stopped cold in his chest at the sight waiting below. The barn was burning. Flames licked hungrily up the old wooden structure, orange light casting monstrous shadows across the yard and through the chaos. Thomas could see Silas struggling desperately with a bucket brigade that was hopelessly inadequate against a fire already fully engulfing the roof. Thomas kicked his horse into a full gallop. Evelyn close behind him, adrenaline drowning out every other thought except the animals trapped inside and the decades of work about to burn to ash in front of him. "The horses!" Silas shouted the moment Thomas reached the yard, his face streaked with soot and desperate fear. "Couldn't get to them, Thomas fires already through the east wall." Thomas didn't hesitate. He was off his horse and running toward the burning structure before Evelyn could even call out his name, grabbing a wet blanket from the water trough and pressing it against his face as he plunged through the smoke toward the panicked screaming of trapped animals. Inside, chaos rained smoke thick enough to choke on flames climbing the support beams, 3 horses screaming and thrashing against their stall doors in blind terror. Thomas worked fast, coughing against the smoke, throwing stall doors open, one after another, slapping panicked flanks to drive terrified animals toward the exit before the roof gave way entirely. He'd freed 2 of the 3 when the beam above him cracked with a sound like a gunshot. "Thomas!" Evelyn screamed somewhere outside, raw with terror. He barely had time to throw himself sideways before the burning beam crashed down exactly where he'd been standing, sending up a shower of sparks and embers that seared across his arm as he scrambled backward. The 3rd horse, the young gelding Evelyn had calmed weeks earlier, was still trapped rearing in blind panic against a stall door that had jammed in the heat. Thomas didn't think. He simply moved, throwing his weight against the door once, twice, feeling the wood finally give way on the 3rd desperate strike, and the gelding bolted past him toward the exit in a blur of terrified motion. Thomas followed a half-second behind, stumbling out into the night air, just as another section of roof collapsed inward with a roar that shook the ground beneath his feet. Evelyn reached him before he'd even fully caught his breath, her hands frantic against his face, his chest checking for injuries with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have. "You're burned!" she said, her voice breaking as she found the angry red mark along his forearm. "Thomas, you could have died in there." "Horses are out," he managed between coughs. "That's what matters. You matter?" Evelyn's voice cracked entirely, now tears streaking through the soot on her face. "I can't lose you, Thomas. Not you too. Not after everything." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They stood together watching the barn collapse in on itself, decades of Thomas's careful work reduced to embers and ash in less than an hour, and Thomas felt something cold and furious settle where the earlier fear had been. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly, once the immediate danger had passed and the fire had burned down to smoldering ruin. Silas, soot-streaked, and grim, nodded slowly. "Found this near the east wall before you 2 rode in." He held out a scrap of fabric, half-burned, but still recognizable fine gray wool, the exact same material as the coats worn by the hired men who'd flanked Reeves's carriage that afternoon. "He did this?" Evelyn whispered, staring at the fabric with a mixture of horror and fury. "Because he knows we're fighting back. Because we went to Voss." "He couldn't have known that already," Thomas said, though uncertainty colored his voice. "Couldn't he?" Evelyn's expression turned grim. "Thomas, a man like Josiah Reeves, doesn't leave loose ends. If he suspected for even a moment that Voss might turn on him, might confess what he'd been paid to do, he'd move to silence that risk immediately. And he'd send a message to you at the same time to remind you exactly how much power he holds over everything you've built." Thomas looked at the smoldering ruin of his barn, at the exhausted, smoke-stained faces of Evelyn and Silas standing beside him, at the fragile signed confession still folded in his coat pocket, and felt the full weight of what they were truly up against settle heavy across his shoulders. 29 days, he said quietly. "What? Reeves gave us 30 days before the foreclosure. That was yesterday. We've got 29 days left and he's already burning my barn to remind me how easily he can take everything else." Thomas's jaw tightened with grim determination. "He's not going to stop with a barn, Evelyn. Whatever comes next, we need to be ready for it." Evelyn stepped closer, gripping his uninjured arm tightly. "Then we get ready. Together. They didn't have long to prepare. 3 days later, a rider arrived from the territorial marshal's office in the county seat, and the news he carried sent Thomas's carefully constructed plan crashing down as thoroughly as the barn had. "Marshal wanted you to know personally," the rider said, clearly uncomfortable delivering the message. "Harlan Voss is dead. Found him in the river 2 days ago. Marshal's calling it an accident. Man had too much to drink and fell from the bridge near his office." Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, horror draining every bit of color from her face. "That's not an accident," Thomas said, his voice going deadly quiet. "Marshal seems to think it is Mr. Grayson. No evidence otherwise. No witnesses." The rider shifted uncomfortably. "There's something else too. The signed statement Voss supposedly gave you, Marshal, says without Voss alive to confirm it under oath, a written confession from a dead man carries a lot less weight in any formal proceeding, especially against a man with Mr. Reeves's legal resources." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him for the second time in less than a week. The fragile weapon they'd fought so hard to secure, dissolving into something far less certain than they desperately needed it to be. "He killed him," Evelyn whispered once the rider had ridden away, her voice shaking with horrified realization. "Thomas, he actually killed a man to protect himself." "We don't know that for certain." "Don't we?" Evelyn's eyes were wide with a fear Thomas hadn't seen from her since the very first night he'd learned her true name. "Thomas, this isn't a man who threatens. This is a man who acts decisively, ruthlessly the moment he feels even slightly threatened. And now he knows we're fighting back with everything we have, and he's already shown us exactly how far he's willing to go to win." Thomas pulled her close, feeling her tremble against him, understanding with sudden terrible clarity that they were no longer simply fighting for a ranch or even for Evelyn's freedom. They were fighting for their lives. 26 days, he said grimly, staring out toward the horizon where Reeves's men could be watching from any direction at any moment. 26 days, and we need a plan that doesn't depend on a dead man's confession, or Josiah Reeves is going to take everything from us, the ranch, your freedom, and possibly far more than either. Evelyn looked up at him, fear still bright in her eyes, but something else steadying beneath it, the same fearless resolve that had made her walk toward a stampeding horse without hesitation weeks earlier. "Then we find another way," she said firmly. "Because I refuse to let that man win. Not after everything we've already survived to get here." Thomas held her gaze, drawing strength from her unshakable determination, even as the danger around them grew more lethal by the day. 26 days, he repeated. "Let's make them count." Grief and fear made poor company for clear thinking, but Thomas forced himself past both in the days following Voss's death, because 26 days had a way of feeling like 26 hours, once a man understood exactly what he stood to lose. "We need another approach," Evelyn said, pacing the length of the kitchen, while Thomas sat with a sheet of paper covered in crossed-out ideas. "Voss is gone. His confession is worthless without him alive to swear to it. We need something Reeves can't silence by throwing a man in a river." "Something bigger than one frightened clerk," Thomas agreed. "Something that doesn't depend on a single witness Reeves can make disappear." Silas, leaning in the doorway with his hat in his hands, cleared his throat. "Might be I know something that could help." Both of them turned to him. "Wasn't going to say nothing," Silas admitted, "on account of it not seeming my business. But I got a cousin works the Bozeman Bank, the real territorial bank, not that little outpost Voss ran. And near 2 years back, my cousin wrote me a letter griping about a fancy Eastern buyer sniffing around trying to purchase distressed mortgages off ranchers who'd fallen behind, paid cash, moved fast. My cousin thought it was strange enough to mention it on account of the buyer's name." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What name?" "Reeves," Silas said. "Josiah Reeves." Evelyn went very still. "He's done this before." "Sounds like it," Silas said. "My cousin said there were at least 2 other ranching families lost everything to that exact same scheme. Man buys up a struggling mortgage, cheap calls the balance due. All at once family can't pay, he takes the land for pennies on what it's worth. Thomas stood so fast his chair scraped hard against the floorboards. If he's done this before, there's a pattern. Other families, other bankers who processed those sales, maybe other men who didn't die conveniently before they could testify. That's 2 years ago, Thomas, Evelyn said, hope and caution warring in her voice. Bozeman's a full day's ride, and if Reeves finds out we're digging into his past dealings, then we don't give him time to find out, Thomas said. We ride tonight. They left before dawn, Silas staying behind again to watch the ranch and the smoldering wreckage of the barn, a shotgun never far from his hand. The ride to Bozeman stretched long and tense, both of them watching the horizon for riders who might belong to Reeves, though none appeared. Evelyn rode close beside Thomas, her earlier fear replaced by a hard, focused determination that reminded him not for the first time exactly why she'd survived a childhood designed to break her spirit and come out the other side sharper instead of broken. You're quiet, Thomas said somewhere past the halfway point. I'm thinking about my father, Evelyn said, wondering how much he actually knew about the man he was selling me to, whether he ever asked questions about how Reeves built his fortune, or whether the money was simply enough to make him stop caring. Does it matter now? It matters to me, Evelyn admitted quietly. I spent my whole life believing my father loved me just in some cold, distant way I didn't fully understand. Now I wonder if he ever loved me at all, or if I was only ever an asset to be traded when the numbers made sense. Thomas reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. Whatever your father did or didn't do, Evelyn, it doesn't change what you're worth. Not one bit. Her fingers tightened around his grateful, though her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon ahead. Bozeman's bank sat at the center of town, larger and more official than the modest outpost Voss had run, and the man behind the desk, a stern, silver-spectacled banker named Elias Cormack, proved considerably harder to intimidate than Voss had been. Mr. Reeves, Cormack said once Thomas had explained the situation, his expression darkening with a fury that took both of them by surprise. That name has haunted this office for 2 years, Mr. Grayson. I'll tell you plainly, I've been waiting for someone to walk through that door asking exactly the questions you're asking. Evelyn leaned forward. You know about the other families. I know more than that. Cormack rose and moved to a locked cabinet behind his desk, retrieving a thick folder that looked well worn from handling. 2 years ago, a Boston financier began purchasing distressed mortgages from struggling ranch families across this territory, always through cash offers, moved suspiciously fast, always timed to strike the moment a family fell even slightly behind on payments. The Kellerman family lost 800 acres. The Dawson brothers lost their entire cattle operation. In both cases, Josiah Reeves was the buyer. Did they fight it? Thomas asked. The Kellermans tried, hired a lawyer out of Helena, filed a formal complaint. Cormack's expression turned grim. Their lawyer's office burned down 3 weeks later. Complaint mysteriously vanished from the territorial records. The Kellermans left the territory entirely after that. Nobody's heard from them since. The room went cold with the weight of that implication. You think Reeves was behind the fire? Evelyn said quietly. I think, Cormack said carefully, that it would be a remarkable coincidence if he wasn't Miss Whitmore, though I have no proof, only a very strong suspicion I've carried for 2 years with nowhere to take it. You have proof now, Thomas said, tapping the folder. Records, dates, patterns, records of legitimate mortgage purchases, Mr. Grayson. Everything Reeves did with the Kellermans and the Dawsons on paper was entirely legal. Aggressive, predatory, morally reprehensible, but legal. That's not proof of a crime. That's proof of a pattern, which is a very different thing in a courtroom. Thomas felt frustration rising sharp and helpless. Then what would prove a crime? Cormack was quiet for a long moment, studying them both with careful, calculating eyes. Your mortgage, Mr. Grayson. The one purchased through the fraudulent transfer at the Cedar Hollow land office. That transaction wasn't legal, was it? Backdated signatures, falsified board approval, a forged transfer that never went through proper banking channels. Voss confessed it in writing, Evelyn said. But Voss is dead. Then we need something Voss's death can't erase, Cormac said. Every legitimate mortgage transfer requires notification sent through the Territorial Banking Registry in Helena, a copy retained regardless of what happens to any local paperwork. If your transfer truly was fraudulent, Mr. Grayson, there will be no matching registry entry in Helena. That absence, gentlemen, is proof no amount of intimidation can make disappear, because it exists in triplicate, filed by clerks who have never met Josiah Reeves and have no reason to fear him. Hope flickered fragile but real in Thomas's chest for the first time in days. How fast can we get that record? Helena's 2 days' ride from here, Cormac said. But I have a faster option if you're willing to trust a telegraph and a colleague I've known 20 years. He was already moving toward the door, calling for his clerk. Give me until morning. I'll have an answer wired back before you've finished your coffee. The wait stretched agonizing and long, Thomas and Evelyn taking a room at the town's small hotel, both of them too tense to sleep, sitting instead at the small table by the window, watching the street below for any sign of trouble. If this works, Evelyn said quietly, somewhere past midnight, if we actually have proof, real proof that can't be silenced, what happens then? Then we take it to the territorial marshal. Formal charges, fraud at minimum. If Cormac's right about the Kellermans, maybe worse. And if my father finds out I helped bring down the man he chose for me. Thomas turned to look at her fully. Does that frighten you more than losing this fight? Evelyn considered the question with the same careful honesty she brought to everything. No, she said finally. I think I stopped being frightened of my father's disappointment somewhere around the third time he sold me for something he wanted more. I think what frightens me now is losing you. Losing this life I've only just started building. Thomas reached for her hand across the small table. You're not losing anything, Evelyn. Not while I'm still breathing. You said that before the barn burned down. And I meant it before, and I mean it now. His grip tightened, steady, certain. Reeves can burn my barn. He can try to steal my land through forged paperwork. He can send hired men to threaten and intimidate and even kill, God help us. But he cannot make me stop fighting for you, Evelyn. That's not something money can purchase. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, though this time they carried something other than fear. Something that looked unmistakably like love, finally allowed to surface without apology. I used to think love was a weakness, she whispered. Something my mother used against my father. Something men like Reeves exploited in women foolish enough to feel it openly. I promised myself I'd never let anyone hold that kind of power over me. And now I think, Evelyn said softly, that loving you might be the strongest thing I've ever done. Because it terrifies me completely, and I'm choosing it anyway. Thomas closed the distance between them, cupping her face gently in his hands. Then choose it with me. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Cormac's telegraph says, choose this. Choose us. I already have, Evelyn whispered right before his lips found hers. The telegraph arrived at dawn, and Cormac's face when he delivered it told them everything before he'd said a single word. No registry entry, he said, breathless from having run the entire way from his office. Helena has no record whatsoever of any mortgage transfer involving your property, Mr. Grayson. Not on the date Reeves claims, not any date at all. The transfer was never properly filed. It was never legal. It was, as we suspected, entirely fraudulent from the beginning. Evelyn let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, gripping Thomas's arm so tightly it nearly hurt. That's proof, Thomas said, hardly daring to believe it. Real proof. Proof enough to take to the territorial marshal immediately, Cormac confirmed. Proof enough, I'd wager, to finally give the Kellermans and the Dawsons a reason to come forward too, once word spreads that someone actually fought back and won. They rode straight for the county seat. The telegraph and Cormac's sworn statement carefully secured both of them, moving with the fierce, focused energy of people who finally saw a path through what had felt for days like an impossible fight. The territorial marshal, a weathered veteran named Marshal Coburn, who'd clearly seen every manner of frontier corruption in his years of service, listened to their entire account without interruption, his expression growing darker with every detail. "Fraudulent mortgage transfer," he said, finally tapping the documents spread across his desk. "Falsified banking records, a dead land agent who conveniently drowned right after signing a confession, and now evidence suggesting a pattern stretching back 2 years, with at least 2 other families driven off their land through the same scheme." "Is it enough?" Thomas asked. "It's enough to issue a warrant," Coburn said grimly. "Enough to formally charge Josiah Reeves with fraud, and enough to open an investigation into Voss's death that I should have pushed harder on from the start if I'm honest." He met Thomas's eyes steadily. "I'll ride out with 2 deputies today. Where's Reeves staying?" "Cedar Hollow Hotel, far as we know," Thomas said. "Unless he's already made a move." Coburn was already reaching for his hat. "Then we'd best not waste any more time finding out." They arrived back in Cedar Hollow by late afternoon, the marshal and his deputies riding hard beside them, and found the town in a state of tension that told Thomas immediately something had already gone wrong. Walt met them at the edge of town, his face grim. "Thomas, thank God. Reeves knows you rode out. One of his men's been watching the road for 2 days. The second you left for Bozeman, he started making moves." "What kind of moves?" Evelyn's voice was tight with fear. "He's been to the bank," Walt said, "trying to accelerate the foreclosure paperwork through a different channel entirely, one that doesn't need the original mortgage transfer at all. Man's got lawyers filing something in the territorial court, directly some kind of emergency petition." Marshal Coburn's expression hardened. "He's trying to beat us to the courthouse." "There's more," Walt said, glancing toward Evelyn with obvious reluctance. "He's also been talking to Mrs. Higgins and half the town, telling folks Evelyn's not right in the head, that her family's worried sick, that you've been keeping a sick woman against her family's wishes, Thomas manipulating her for her inheritance." Evelyn went white with fury. "That's an outright lie." "Doesn't matter if it's a lie if enough people believe it," Walt said grimly. "He's spending money all over town, Thomas, buying loyalty, buying doubt, trying to turn public opinion before the law can catch up to him." Thomas felt cold determination settle over the fear building in his chest. "Then we get to the courthouse first, and we make sure the truth reaches more people than his lies do." They rode straight for the small territorial courthouse at the edge of town, Marshal Coburn's deputies flanking them, and found Reeves already there, standing on the courthouse steps in his fine coat, addressing a small but growing crowd of curious townsfolk with the practiced, sympathetic tone of a grieving man doing everything he could to save someone he loved. "Simply want what's best for her," Reeves was saying as they approached. "Evelyn has always struggled with episodes, shall we say. Delusions of independence that concern her family greatly. We only want to bring her home where she can receive proper care." "That's enough," Thomas said, his voice cutting across the crowd loud and hard. Reeves turned, and for just a moment, something like genuine surprise crossed his composed features at the sight of Marshal Coburn and his deputies standing beside them. "Mr. Grayson," Reeves said, quickly recovering his smooth, false warmth. "And Marshal Coburn, what an unexpected pleasure. I was just explaining to these good people the unfortunate circumstances surrounding my fiancé's condition." "Your fiancé," Evelyn said, stepping forward, her voice ringing clear and steady across the gathered crowd, "is standing right here, Mr. Reeves, and she is entirely sound of mind, sound enough to know exactly what you've done." "Evelyn, please, this hysteria is exactly what concerns your family." "Josiah Reeves," Marshal Coburn interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "You're under arrest for fraud, forgery of banking documents, and I'll be adding a charge of suspected involvement in the death of Harlan Voss pending a full investigation." The crowd's murmuring rose sharply, shock rippling through the gathered townsfolk. Reeves's composure finally cracked entirely, fury and disbelief warring across his face. "This is absurd. I am a respected businessman from one of Boston's finest families. You cannot possibly believe the word of some frontier rancher and a hysterical girl over—" "We don't need to believe anybody's word, Mr. Reeves," Thomas said, stepping forward and holding up the telegraph, the sworn statement, everything Cormac had helped them gather. "We've got proof. A mortgage transfer that was never legally filed in the territorial registry. Falsified signatures. a pattern stretching back 2 years to the Kellerman and Dawson families, who I'd wager would be very interested to learn there's finally a case against the man who destroyed their lives. The crowd's murmuring grew louder still, and Thomas watched something shift in the gathered faces, suspicion turning toward Reeves instead of Evelyn for the first time since he'd arrived in Cedar Hollow, spreading his careful lies. "You have no proof of anything regarding Voss." Reeves snapped his careful mask, slipping further with every passing second. "The man drowned. A tragic accident, nothing more." "Funny thing about accidents," Marshal Coburn said dryly, "how they always seem to happen to men right before they're set to testify against powerful people." He nodded to his deputies. "Take him into custody." Reeves's eyes darted wildly around the crowd, calculating, searching for some escape from a trap that had finally completely closed around him. "You'll regret this," he hissed as the deputies moved to restrain him. "All of you. My family has connections that reach further than this pathetic little territory. I will be free within the week, and when I am Mr. Grayson, you will wish you'd simply handed her over when I asked politely." "You didn't ask politely," Thomas said, his voice cold and steady. "You threatened and you burned and you killed a man to protect yourself. Whatever connections you've got, Reeves, they're not going to erase what this territory just watched you become." The deputies led Reeves away, still shouting threats that grew increasingly desperate and hollow with every step, until the courthouse doors finally closed behind him, and the crowd's murmuring settled into something like stunned, relieved silence. Evelyn sagged against Thomas's side, the fight finally draining out of her, now that the immediate danger had passed, replaced by exhausted, disbelieving relief. "It's over," she whispered. "Not entirely," Thomas said carefully. "He'll have lawyers, money for bail maybe. This fight isn't finished yet, Evelyn." "But it's different now," she said, looking up at him with something like hope beginning to bloom behind the exhaustion in her eyes. "Now the whole territory knows the truth. Now there's a marshal's investigation and Cormac's evidence, and the Kellermans and Dawsons will have their own case to bring forward. He's not fighting a rancher and a runaway bride anymore, Thomas. He's fighting the truth itself, and truth has a way of being harder to silence than any single witness." Walt approached them, then his earlier grim expression replaced with something warmer, prouder. "Whole town's talking, Thomas. Not about scandal anymore. About how a frontier rancher and his wife stood up to one of the wealthiest men in Boston and won." Mrs. Higgins herself approached a moment later, looking uncharacteristically flustered. "I owe you an apology, Miss Hart. Whitmore. Whatever your name truly is." Her weathered face softened with genuine remorse. "I spread doubt about you when that man first started talking. I should have known better than to trust a stranger's silver tongue over the character you've shown this whole town these past weeks." "Thank you, Mrs. Higgins," Evelyn said, and Thomas could hear the emotion thicken her voice. "That means more than you know." The following days brought a flood of consequences neither Thomas nor Evelyn had fully anticipated. Word of Reeves's arrest spread through the territory faster than any newspaper could have carried it, and within a week a telegraph arrived from Helena confirming that the Kellerman family, tracked down through Cormac's persistent efforts, had agreed to return and testify about their own stolen land. The Dawson brothers followed shortly after, their long-buried anger finally finding an outlet after 2 years of believing justice would never come for what they'd lost. Bail, as Reeves had threatened, did eventually free him from the county jail, backed by resources his family wired from Boston within days of his arrest. But the freedom he purchased proved hollow and temporary. Every new witness, adding weight to a case that grew more damning by the week. Every attempt his lawyers made to intimidate or silence the growing chorus of victims, meeting the immovable wall of a marshal now personally invested in seeing justice done. Charles Whitmore Sr., Evelyn's father, arrived in the territory himself 3 weeks after Reeves's arrest, and the confrontation Thomas had braced himself for turned out to be something far more complicated than simple villainy. He found the older man waiting on the ranch's front porch one afternoon alone without hired men or intimidating carriages, looking smaller and more uncertain than Thomas had expected from the description Evelyn had given of a man powerful enough to sell his own daughter. "Mr. Grayson," Whitmore said, rising slowly. "I've come to speak with my daughter if she'll permit it, and with you if you'll allow me the courtesy." Evelyn appeared in the doorway behind Thomas, her expression guarded wary, though she didn't retreat back inside. "Father?" "Evelyn." Whitmore's voice cracked slightly on her name, something raw and genuine bleeding through his careful composure. "I've spent the ride from the train station rehearsing what I might say to you, and I find I still don't have adequate words." "Try." Evelyn set her voice steady, despite the visible tension in her shoulders. Whitmore was quiet a long moment, his eyes moving over her. The sun-touched skin, the calloused hands, the fierce, unguarded strength that ranch life and genuine love had carved into someone who'd once been forced to hide behind careful composure just to survive her own family. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About Reeves, about the debt I believed his marriage to you would settle. I told myself I was securing your future, protecting our family's position, when in truth I was simply too afraid of financial ruin to ask hard questions about the man I was handing you to." "Did you know what he'd done?" Evelyn asked. "The other families? What he did to Harlan Voss?" "God help me know," Whitmore said, and the horror in his voice sounded genuine enough that even Thomas found himself believing it. "I learned of the fraud charges the same way half of Boston did Evelyn, through newspapers, through whispered scandal, through the slow, sickening realization that I very nearly sold my only daughter to a murderer to settle a debt that in hindsight I could have found another way to pay." Evelyn's composure cracked slightly, old hurt bleeding through years of careful control. "You didn't ask, Father. That's the part I can't forgive so easily. You didn't ask what kind of man he truly was. You didn't ask what I wanted. You simply decided the way you've always decided everything about my life and expected me to accept it." "You're right," Whitmore said quietly. "I have no defense for that other than to say I've had 3 weeks on a westbound train to understand exactly how badly I failed you, and I intend to spend considerably longer than 3 weeks making whatever amends you'll allow me to make." The silence that followed stretched long and uncertain Thomas, watching Evelyn wrestle visibly with years of complicated hurt, old love, and hard-won independence. "I'm not coming back to Boston," she said finally. "I'm not asking you to," Whitmore said, and something like relief passed briefly across his face. "I came to see for myself the life you've built, and to say, if you'll permit an old fool the words, that I am proud of the woman standing in front of me. Prouder than I ever managed to tell you when you lived under my roof." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother hiding this time. "That's 23 years too late, Father." "I know," Whitmore said softly, "but I hope it's not too late to try all the same." Thomas watched Evelyn's guarded posture soften just slightly, just enough to suggest that whatever healing might eventually happen between father and daughter, it had at least begun with honesty neither had offered the other in years. Whitmore stayed only 2 days long enough to see the ranch to shake Thomas's hand with something like genuine respect, and to promise before he boarded the train back east that he'd testify against Reeves himself, if the territorial court required it, a promise that ultimately proved decisive in the trial that followed 6 weeks later. Josiah Reeves was convicted on charges of fraud and forgery. The evidence overwhelming once the Kellermans, the Dawsons-Cormack, and finally Whitmore himself added their testimony to the mountain Thomas and Evelyn had first uncovered. The charge related to Voss's death proved harder to prove conclusively, though the circumstantial evidence was damning enough that few in the courtroom left doubting the truth of it. Reeves was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, his fortune seized to compensate the families he'd defrauded, his name reduced from Boston high society's rising star to a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties for years afterward. Thomas's mortgage restored properly to the territorial bank and paid down steadily with the compensation awarded through the fraud settlement was fully clear within the year. A debt finally free of any shadow, any threat, any man's cruel leverage. The barn was rebuilt by Autumn Cedar Hollow's whole community, turning out to help raise the new structure in a single determined day. An unspoken gesture of apology from a town that had briefly foolishly doubted the woman who'd since proven herself more resilient and more honest than half the gossips who'd once questioned her. It was beneath the new barn's fresh timber frame, months after the trial had finally closed, that Thomas found himself standing across from Evelyn one quiet evening, his heart pounding harder than it had facing down Josiah Reeves himself. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "About what?" "About how I wrote that letter almost a year ago asking for a simple wife. Someone practical. Someone who wouldn't ask much of me and wouldn't give me much reason to feel anything at all." He reached into his coat pocket, his hand closing around something small he'd carried there for 3 days, working up the nerve. "I was wrong about what I wanted, Evelyn. I didn't need simple. I needed you." Evelyn's breath caught as he lowered himself to one knee in front of her, opening his palm to reveal a modest gold ring simple in its craftsmanship, but chosen with more care than he'd put into any decision in years. "Evelyn Whitmore," he said, "you stepped off that stage, a stranger with more courage than any woman I'd ever met. And somewhere between calming a spooked horse and standing up to a man who tried to own you like property, you became the reason I remember what it feels like to actually live again. I'm not asking you to be simple. I'm asking you to be mine exactly as complicated and fierce and unbreakable as you already are. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed freely down Evelyn's face, though her smile shone brighter than Thomas had ever seen it. "You already made me your wife the day I stepped off that stage, Thomas Grayson," she said, laughing through her tears as she pulled him up into a fierce embrace. "But yes, God, yes, I'll marry you again properly this time in front of everyone who ever doubted us." Thomas slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and when he finally kissed her, Evelyn felt every last fragment of fear she'd carried since that terrified night, packing a single suitcase, finally completely dissolve. News of the engagement reached Cedar Hollow before Thomas had even finished walking Evelyn back to the house, because Silas had been watching from the corral the entire time and hollered the news across the yard the moment he saw the ring catch the evening light. "About time," the old cowboy shouted, throwing his hat in the air with more enthusiasm than Thomas had ever seen from him. "Was starting to think I'd have to propose to her myself just to speed things along." Evelyn laughed, wiping fresh tears from her cheeks, and Thomas felt something in his chest loosen that had been wound tight for the better part of a year. But even joy Thomas was learning rarely arrived without its own complications trailing close behind. "There's a letter," Walt said the next morning, riding out earlier than usual, his expression carrying the particular grimness Thomas had come to recognize meant trouble wasn't quite finished with them yet. "Came in on this morning's stage, from the territorial court." Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he broke the seal. Evelyn, reading over his shoulder, her breath catching audibly at the words printed across the page. "Reeves is appealing," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "His lawyers are claiming procedural errors in the trial. They want a new hearing." "That's not possible," Thomas said, scanning the letter again as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming. "Cormac's evidence was solid. Marshal Coburn built an airtight case." "Money doesn't need things to be possible, Thomas," Evelyn said, old fear creeping back into her voice despite months of hard-won safety. "It only needs enough lawyers willing to manufacture doubt, and Josiah Reeves's family has more money than this entire territory combined." Thomas folded the letter slowly, forcing his voice to stay steady, even as dread pooled cold in his stomach. "When's the hearing?" 3 weeks, Walt said. "County seat courthouse. Same marshal presiding at least, which is something." Evelyn's hands had gone cold in his, and Thomas pulled her close, feeling her tremble against him, the way she had that very first frightened night she'd knocked on his door. "We already beat him once," Thomas said firmly. "We'll beat him again. What if the evidence isn't enough a second time? What if his lawyers find some clever way to make the fraud sound like an honest mistake, or worse, make it sound like Cormac and I conspired to frame an innocent man? Then we make sure it's not just Cormac's word, or mine, or Silas's." Thomas set his mind already turning toward solutions the way it had turned toward the mortgage fraud months earlier. "We bring the Kellermans back, the Dawsons, your own father if he'll travel again. We fill that courtroom with every single person Reeves has ever hurt, until there's no lawyer clever enough to make 3 weeks of testimony sound like coincidence." Evelyn looked up at him, fear still bright in her eyes, but something steadier growing beneath it, the same fearless resolve that had carried her 2,000 miles from a life that tried to own her. "Together," she said. "Always together," Thomas confirmed. The 3 weeks that followed passed in a blur of telegraphs and travel arrangements, Thomas and Evelyn working alongside Cormac and Marshal Coburn to ensure that whatever Reeves's lawyers attempted, they would find themselves facing not a single fragile case, but an entire mountain of testimony too large to dismantle with clever legal maneuvering. The Kellermans arrived first, a weathered husband and wife, who'd rebuilt a smaller life 2 counties over after losing everything, their bitterness at finally having a chance for justice evident in every word they spoke. The Dawson brothers followed gruff and determined, carrying documentation of their own stolen cattle operation that added weight neither Thomas nor Evelyn had known still existed. Charles Whitmore arrived on the same train as an unexpected addition, a Boston lawyer named Prescott, retained personally by Whitmore to ensure that whatever resources Reeves's family threw at the appeal, they would meet an equally determined opposition. "I should have done this from the beginning," Whitmore admitted, shaking Thomas's hand with a firmness that suggested genuine resolve rather than mere obligation. "I owe you both considerably more than a lawyer's fee, but it's a start." The hearing itself, when it finally arrived, proved every bit as tense as Thomas had feared. Reeves's lawyers arguing with polished, condescending confidence that the entire case rested on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of witnesses with personal grudges against their client. But when the Kellermans took the stand, when the Dawson brothers described watching their cattle operation dismantled through the exact same fraudulent pattern, when Cormac presented the Helena registry records once more, alongside 3 additional cases his continued investigation had uncovered, in the intervening months, the courtroom's mood shifted decisively. Reeves himself, seated beside his lawyers, grew visibly paler with each new witness, his earlier arrogant composure crumbling into something that looked for the first time since Thomas had met him genuinely afraid. "Mr. Reeves," Marshal Coburn said once the final witness had finished testifying, "would you care to offer any explanation for why 5 separate families across this territory have now testified to the exact same fraudulent scheme?" Reeves said nothing, his silence more damning than any answer could have been. The appeal was denied within the hour, the original conviction upheld in full, and this time with the additional testimony entered permanently into the territorial record. There would be no further appeals possible, no clever lawyer, no Boston connection, no amount of money capable of erasing the mountain of truth that now stood immovable against him. "It's truly over," Evelyn whispered, once they'd stepped outside the courthouse into afternoon sunlight that felt for the first time in months entirely unclouded by threat. "It's over," Thomas confirmed, pulling her close. Around them, the Kellermans embraced tearfully. The Dawson brothers shook hands with Marshal Coburn, and Charles Whitmore stood a small distance away, watching his daughter with an expression of quiet, humbled pride that suggested a man finally beginning to understand exactly what he'd nearly lost. "Evelyn." Whitmore approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome, even after months of careful correspondence and one difficult but honest visit. "I wanted to give you something before I return east." He held out a small velvet box, and when Evelyn opened it, her breath caught sharply. Inside sat a delicate silver locket worn with age but clearly treasured, engraved with initials that weren't her own. "That belonged to your grandmother," Whitmore said quietly. "My mother. She left it to me with instructions to give it to my daughter when she married a man worthy of her, rather than a man convenient for our family's ledgers." His voice caught slightly. "I should have honored that instruction the first time, Evelyn. I'm grateful for the chance to honor it now." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the locket around her neck, her fingers lingering against the worn silver. "Thank you, Father," she said softly. And for the first time since Thomas had known her, the words carried no bitterness at all, only fragile, hopeful healing. They returned to Cedar Hollow 3 days later to find the whole town had already begun preparations for a wedding neither Thomas nor Evelyn had officially announced yet, Mrs. Higgins having apparently decided that a courthouse victory over Josiah Reeves was cause enough to begin planning festivities without waiting for formal confirmation. "I hope you don't mind," the older woman said, not sounding remotely apologetic. "But this town has been waiting a long while to celebrate something good. Thomas Grayson and I intend to see it done properly." Evelyn laughed, genuine and unguarded, watching the beginnings of decorations already appearing along the main street. "I don't mind at all, Mrs. Higgins. Though I confess I'm curious what you have planned." "Everything," Mrs. Higgins said firmly. "This whole territory watched you fight for your happiness, dear. Now this whole territory intends to watch you claim it." The wedding took place 6 weeks later beneath the same old oak tree at the edge of Thomas's property, where he'd once buried his grief alongside Sarah's memory, now transformed into something entirely different, a place of new beginnings rather than old sorrow. Thomas stood waiting as the whole of Cedar Hollow gathered Walt beside him, serving as best man with an expression of undisguised pride. Silas seated in the front row, wearing a suit that clearly hadn't been worn in decades, and looking thoroughly uncomfortable in it, though nothing could have kept him from attending. When Evelyn appeared walking toward him on her father's arm, Thomas felt every fear he'd ever carried about opening his heart again dissolve completely. She wore a simple ivory dress, nothing like the elaborate silks she might have worn in Boston, her grandmother's locket resting against her collarbone, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, exactly the way Thomas had come to love it best. "You look terrified," she whispered once she'd reached him, her father stepping back with visible emotion. "I am," Thomas admitted, taking her hands in his. "Terrified I'll wake up and discover none of this was real." "It's real," Evelyn promised, squeezing his hands tightly. "I'm not going anywhere, Thomas Grayson. Not ever again." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows, spoken with more emotion than either of them had expected, tears from half the gathered crowd, and a kiss that sealed a promise neither Thomas nor Evelyn intended to break for the rest of their lives. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher announced, and the crowd's cheering rose loud enough to startle birds from the surrounding trees. That evening, as the celebration continued long into the night, string music and laughter carrying across the ranch that had nearly been stolen from them, Thomas found a quiet moment alone with Evelyn beneath the same oak tree where they'd exchanged their vows. "I keep thinking about that letter I wrote," he admitted, watching starlight filter through the branches above them. "Asking for a simple woman, someone who wouldn't ask much of me." "You've mentioned that before," Evelyn said, smiling. "I know, but I think I finally understand why I wrote it that way." Thomas turned to face her, fully taking both her hands in his. "I wasn't looking for simple, Evelyn. I was looking for safe. I thought if I asked for someone quiet, someone who wouldn't challenge me or ask me to feel things again, I could protect myself from ever hurting the way I hurt after losing Sarah. And instead, you got me," Evelyn said softly. "About as far from safe as a person could possibly be." "Instead, I got exactly what I actually needed," Thomas corrected gently. "Someone brave enough to fight a father who tried to sell her like property. Someone strong enough to calm a stampeding horse with nothing but her voice. Someone who taught me that safety was never the same thing as living, Evelyn. You didn't just survive everything Reeves and your father threw at you. You taught me how to actually live again." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, though her smile remained radiant despite them. "I used to think love made a person weak, Thomas. My whole life I watched my mother lose herself trying to please my father, watched wealthy men treat women like decorative property, and I promised myself I'd never let anyone hold that kind of power over me. And now I understand that real love isn't about losing yourself at all." Evelyn's hand found the locket at her throat, then moved to rest over Thomas's heart. "It's about finding someone who makes you more entirely yourself than you ever managed to be alone. You never once asked me to be smaller, Thomas. Not even when it would have been easier, safer, simpler for both of us. You just asked me to be exactly who I already was." Thomas pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "That's all I'll ever ask, Evelyn. For the rest of our lives." The months that followed brought their own steady rhythm of building something neither Thomas nor Evelyn had quite dared imagine during those frightened, dangerous weeks fighting Josiah Reeves. The compensation from the fraud settlement, combined with careful management Evelyn brought from years of watching her father's business dealings, allowed them to expand the ranch considerably beyond what Thomas had ever managed alone. New cattle, New grazing land purchased fairly and legally this time, and a barn rebuilt twice the size of the one that had burned, standing as proof that even the worst destruction couldn't permanently claim what they'd chosen to build together. Evelyn started something else too, something that surprised even Thomas with how naturally it seemed to fit her. A small school for the ranch families scattered across the county, teaching children reading and arithmetic during the winter months, when farm work slowed, drawing on an education she'd once resented receiving in Boston. Drawing rooms, and finally finding purpose for it out on the frontier. Never thought I'd see the day, Silas remarked one autumn afternoon, watching a dozen children pile out of the small schoolhouse Thomas had helped build beside the main house, Evelyn following behind them, with the patient, warm authority that had once calmed a stampeding horse, now turned toward considerably smaller, though no less challenging creatures. "See what day?" Thomas asked. "This ranch full of laughter instead of silence," Silas said. "Was starting to think you'd spend your whole life talking to horses instead of people, Thomas Grayson. Glad to be wrong about that." Thomas watched Evelyn laugh at something one of the children said, her whole face bright with an ease and joy that had taken months of safety to fully bloom, and felt gratitude so overwhelming it nearly stole his breath. "So am I, Silas," he said quietly. "So am I." Word came eventually, nearly a year after the wedding, that Josiah Reeves had died in the territorial prison not through violence, but through the slow, ordinary decline of a man who'd spent his entire life believing money could purchase any outcome he desired, only to discover too late that some debts couldn't be settled with wealth alone. Evelyn received the news with quiet, complicated relief rather than celebration. "I thought I'd feel triumphant," she admitted to Thomas that evening, sitting together on the porch watching the sunset behind mountains that had become as familiar to her now as the Boston skyline once had been. "Instead, I just feel tired. Tired of carrying fear I don't need to carry anymore." "That's all right," Thomas said, pulling her close against his side. "You're allowed to simply feel relieved, Evelyn. You don't owe anyone triumph over a man who caused you so much pain. Do you think the Kellermans feel relieved too? The Dawsons?" "I think," Thomas said carefully, "that everyone whose life Reeves touched gets to feel whatever they actually feel without needing to perform grief or triumph for anybody else's benefit. That's part of what he took from all of you, the right to feel things simply without calculation. Maybe it's time to take that back too." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, watching the sky shift through deepening shades of orange and purple. "I don't feel sad he's gone," she said, finally testing the honesty of the words as she spoke them. "I feel like a door finally closed that I've been holding shut with both hands for over a year." "Then let it close," Thomas said gently. "You don't have to hold it anymore." 2 years after their wedding, Evelyn gave birth to a daughter, a fierce, dark-haired girl, who arrived screaming loud enough that Silas, waiting anxiously outside later, swore he'd heard it clear from the north pasture. They named her Charlotte after Evelyn's grandmother, and Thomas held his daughter for the first time with hands that trembled from an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel since burying Sarah years earlier. The terrifying, overwhelming vulnerability of loving something so completely that losing it would break him entirely. "She has your eyes," Evelyn said softly, exhausted but glowing, watching Thomas cradle their daughter with careful, reverent tenderness. "She has your stubbornness already," Thomas said, laughing, as tiny fists waved indignantly at the world she'd just entered. "God help us both." "God help everyone who tries to tell her she's too much of anything," Evelyn corrected, smiling. "I intend to raise her exactly the way I wish someone had raised me. Fierce, unafraid, certain of her own worth long before anyone tries to convince her otherwise. She'll have that," Thomas promised, pressing a gentle kiss to his daughter's forehead. "She'll have both of us making sure of it." Charlotte grew up wild and fearless across Grayson land, chasing chickens through the yard with Silas's patient encouragement, learning to ride almost before she could properly walk, absorbing her mother's quiet strength and her father's steady warmth in equal measure, until the two qualities became simply entirely her own. She grew up knowing the story of how her parents met, not the sanitized version, but the true one, complete with fraud and fire, and a mother brave enough to stand up to a man who tried to own her like property, and a father who chose to fight for love, instead of retreating into safeguarded loneliness. Tell it again. Charlotte would beg some evenings curled beside the fire as she grew older, though she'd heard the story dozens of times already. Tell about the horse and the fire, and how Papa stood up to that terrible man in the courthouse. You've heard it 100 times, little one, Thomas would say, though he never actually refused. I like hearing how you chose each other, Charlotte would insist. Even when it was hard, even when everyone said it was impossible. Evelyn, listening from across the room, would catch Thomas's eye with a smile that still, after all these years, made his chest tighten with the same wondering gratitude he'd felt the very first moment she'd stepped off that dusty stagecoach and asked him about grazing land instead of the house. Cedar Hollow itself changed considerably over the years that followed, growing from a modest frontier town into something larger, more settled. Though it never lost the particular character that had once watched a stranger fight for her freedom and a rancher fight for his heart, and had ultimately, after early doubt, chosen to stand firmly behind both. Mrs. Higgins lived long enough to see Charlotte grow into a young woman as fiercely capable as her mother, and never once let anyone forget that she'd predicted from that very first meeting at the stage depot that Evelyn would prove to be exactly the kind of woman Cedar Hollow needed. Course, I never actually said that. She'd insist to anyone who challenged her memory of events. I said she wasn't simple. Turned out I was right about that too. Walt and Nancy remained close friends throughout the decades that followed their own children growing up alongside Charlotte, the bond between the two families strengthening with every shared harvest, every celebrated wedding, every difficult winter weathered together, the way frontier communities had always weathered hardship, not alone but bound together by choice as much as necessity. Silas worked the ranch until his hands grew too stiff for daily labor, and even then refused to fully retire, spending his final working years teaching Charlotte everything he knew about cattle and land and the particular patience required to earn an animal's trust, rather than simply demand its obedience. Best decision I ever made, he told Thomas once, watching a grown Charlotte, gentle a nervous colt with the same steady voice her mother had once used on a runaway gelding. Staying on this ranch instead of drifting on like I'd planned. Never figured I'd get to watch a whole family built from nothing but courage and stubbornness. Wasn't nothing, Thomas corrected quietly. It was everything, Silas. Still is. Thomas and Evelyn built more than a ranch together in the years that followed the trial. The fire, the wedding beneath the old oak tree. They built a life neither of them could have imagined during those frightened early days. Thomas learning slowly that vulnerability wasn't the weakness he'd once believed it to be, and Evelyn discovering that strength didn't require constant guardedness, that she could be fierce and soft in equal measure, without ever again fearing that softness would be used as a weapon against her. They faced hard winters together, and good harvests, and every ordinary difficulty that came with building a life on frontier land. But they faced none of it alone, the way Thomas once faced his grief in silence, the way Evelyn once faced her family's expectations, without a single ally willing to stand beside her. Some evenings, long after Charlotte had grown and eventually married a good steady man from a neighboring ranch, moving only far enough away to raise her own children, within easy visiting distance, Thomas and Evelyn would sit together beneath that same old oak tree, watching sunset paint the mountains gold, and remember exactly how close they'd come to never finding each other at all. Do you ever think about it? Evelyn asked one such evening, decades into their marriage, her hair gone silver, but her eyes carrying the same fearless spark they'd held the day she stepped off that stagecoach. What might have happened if you'd sent a different letter, if you'd truly gotten the simple, quiet wife you originally asked for? Thomas considered the question seriously. The way he considered most things, Evelyn asked him even after all these years together. I think, he said, finally taking her weathered hand in his, that I would have spent my whole life exactly the way I spent those first 3 years after losing Sarah. Safe, quiet, entirely completely alone, even in a house with another person living in it. He squeezed her hand gently. I asked for simple because I was afraid, Evelyn. Afraid of exactly this, of loving someone so much that losing them would break me entirely. But you taught me that avoiding that risk wasn't safety at all. It was just a slower, quieter kind of loss. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had 1,000 evenings before this one. I think about it too sometimes. What might have happened if I'd stayed in Boston, married Reeves, spent my whole life exactly as small and controlled as my family always intended me to be? You never would have survived that, Thomas said quietly. No, Evelyn agreed. I don't think I would have. Not truly. I think some part of me would have died the same slow death you were dying out here alone, just wrapped in silk instead of solitude. She lifted her head to meet his eyes, decades of shared love and hard-won trust shining in her expression. We saved each other, Thomas. Not in some grand dramatic way, though God knows we had our share of drama trying to get here. We simply chose each other again and again, through every difficulty that tried to convince us we shouldn't. And I'd choose you again, Thomas said, every single time, no matter how many Josiah Reeveses or fraudulent mortgages or burning barns stood between us. Even knowing everything it would cost, especially knowing everything it would cost, Thomas confirmed, pulling her close. Because the alternative was never truly safety, Evelyn. It was just a different kind of loss, one I nearly convinced myself I could live with until you stepped off that stagecoach and taught me exactly what I'd been missing. The sun continued its slow descent behind the mountains, gold light spilling across land that had nearly been stolen by greed and cruelty, now standing instead as proof of everything two determined, courageous people could build when they refused to let fear win. Thomas Grayson had once believed that peace meant silence, that safety meant guarding his heart so carefully nothing could ever hurt him again, the way losing Sarah had hurt him. Evelyn Whitmore had once believed that love was simply another tool powerful men used to control powerless women, that survival meant never fully trusting anyone enough to be truly seen. Both of them had been wrong. Peace, Thomas learned, could sound like laughter echoing across a dinner table each evening, like children's voices calling out from a schoolhouse his wife had built with her own two hands, like an old cowboy's satisfied grunt watching a family grow strong on land that had nearly been lost. Love, Evelyn discovered, wasn't a weapon wielded by the powerful against the vulnerable. It was a choice made freely again and again by two people brave enough to be truly known by each other, fierce enough to fight for that knowing against every threat that tried to tear it away. They had faced fraud and fire, a father's betrayal, and a stranger's cruelty, a man determined to own what he had no right to claim. They had faced all of it together, refusing every single time to let fear convince them that love wasn't worth the risk. And in the end, standing beneath that same old oak tree, where grief had once been buried, and new vows had later been spoken. Thomas Grayson understood with complete, unshakable certainty exactly what he'd found, the day a beautiful stranger stepped off a dusty stagecoach and asked him about grazing land instead of the house. He hadn't found the simple bride he thought he wanted. He had found something infinitely greater, a partner fierce enough to fight beside him through every storm life sent their way, and the unshakable Yong Yuan, lasting proof that the family worth building was never the one that came easy. It was the one worth fighting for. And that, more than any fortune or any fear, was the truest, most enduring victory of all.